Grant Harlow thought he'd buried his past the day he signed the divorce papers. He'd stripped Claire of everything, her name, her savings, her reputation, and walked away to build an empire with a woman who matched his ambition. Tonight, at the Briarstone Charity Gala, surrounded by Asteria City's elite, he finally felt untouchable. Until the crowd parted for a security detail he didn't recognize, and a tech billionaire offered his hand to a woman in sapphire who made Grant's blood run cold, because the woman wearing power like a second skin was the wife he'd destroyed, and she'd brought an army. If you want to see how far revenge can reach when brilliance meets betrayal, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Briarstone Hotel ballroom glittered like a fever dream of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors so polished they reflected the designer gowns and tailored tuxedos of Asteria City's most powerful players. Champagne flutes caught the light as waiters glided between clusters of executives, politicians, and old money families who controlled the city's economic bloodstream. The annual charity gala wasn't really about charity. Everyone knew that. It was about being seen, making connections, and reminding the world exactly where you stood in the hierarchy. Grant Harlow stood near the center of it all, his hand resting possessively on the small of his wife's back as another investment banker congratulated him on the Meridian Capital deal. Sloane Mercer Harlow smiled her practiced smile, the one that had graced 3 magazine covers in the past year, and touched the diamond necklace at her throat with perfectly manicured fingers. "You're too kind, Richard," Grant said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who'd learned to command rooms. The Meridian partnership was inevitable once we demonstrated the synergies. Sometimes the math just works. Richard laughed. A little too loud, a little too eager. Math. Right, that's what we're calling ruthless negotiation tactics now? Grant's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened just slightly. I prefer to think of it as clarity of vision. Knowing what you want and being willing to do what it takes to get there. Sloane squeezed his arm, a subtle reminder to soften, to charm. She was better at reading rooms than he was, better at knowing when to push and when to retreat. It was one of the things that had attracted him to her in the first place. That, and the fact that her family's connections had opened doors that would have taken him another decade to reach on his own. Grant's being modest, Sloane interjected, her voice honeyed and smooth. The Meridian deal restructured 3 underperforming divisions and created nearly 200 jobs. That's not ruthless. That's strategic brilliance. The circle of executives murmured their approval, and Grant felt that familiar surge of satisfaction. This was what winning felt like. This was what he'd worked for, fought for, sacrificed for. As the conversation shifted to market predictions and political maneuvering, Grant let his gaze drift across the ballroom. He spotted Marcus Chen from the Asteria Business Journal talking to a city councilwoman near the ice sculpture, probably digging for his next exposé. Grant made a mental note to have his assistant send Marcus a gift basket. Keep the press friendly, keep the coverage positive. Keep the. His eyes continued to scan the room with the calculated assessment of a predator surveying territory. And then, like a punch to the gut, a name floated toward him from a nearby conversation. Claire Hanley. Can you believe it? I heard she was working at some boutique consulting firm in the Riverside district. Grant's attention snapped to the speaker, a red-haired woman in an emerald gown whose name he couldn't remember. She was talking to an older gentleman with silver hair, both of them holding champagne and speaking in that casual, careless way people did when they thought no one important was listening. Claire Hanley, the silver-haired man repeated, frowning. Why does that name sound familiar? She used to work at Harlow and Associates, back before it was Harlow and Associates, when it was just Grant Harlow working out of a strip mall office in Parkside. The woman laughed, not unkindly, just amused. She was his researcher or analyst or something, did all the grunt work while he schmoozed clients. Grant's jaw tightened. Sloane must have felt the tension ripple through him because she glanced up, her smile faltering just slightly. Everything okay, darling? Fine, he said through his teeth. Just remembered something I need to handle Monday. But he wasn't fine. The mention of Claire's name had dragged him back to a version of himself he'd worked very hard to forget. The version who'd operated out of a cramped office with water-stained ceiling tiles and furniture from a liquidation sale. The version who'd needed someone like Claire to organize his chaos, build his models, polish his presentations until they shined. The version who'd been married to her. It had been practical at the time. He'd needed stability, someone to believe in him when investors didn't, someone to work 18-hour days for equity instead of salary. Claire had been perfect for that role. Smart enough to be useful, humble enough not to demand the spotlight, loyal enough to follow him into uncertainty. And when he'd outgrown that version of himself, when the business had started to take off, and he'd needed a different kind of partner, someone with connections, someone who looked right at events like this, Claire had become a liability. The divorce had been brutal because it had to be. She'd wanted to fight for half of everything they'd built together, claiming she'd been an equal partner in the business. Grant's lawyers had buried her under paperwork, delayed hearings, bled her dry with legal fees until she'd had no choice but to accept the settlement he'd offered. Almost nothing. He'd walked away clean. She'd walked away broken. And he'd never looked back. Grant, Sloane's voice pulled him back to the present. The Wexlers are here. We should say hello. He forced his expression back to neutral, back to the easy confidence that had become his armor. Of course. But as they moved through the crowd, Grant couldn't quite shake the memory of Claire's face the last time he'd seen her. In the courthouse, after the final hearing, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her voice steady as she'd said, "I hope it was worth it." It had been. Of course it had been. The Wexler greeting lasted 15 minutes of perfectly choreographed small talk. Jonathan Wexler controlled 3 major development projects in the city's expanding tech corridor, and his wife Amanda sat on the boards of half the cultural institutions that mattered. Sloane knew exactly which compliments to deploy, exactly how long to linger, exactly when to excuse them with grace. As they moved away, Grant caught Marcus Chen watching him from across the room. The journalist raised his glass in a silent salute, and Grant returned the gesture. Keep your enemies closer, and your press contacts closest of all. This is your night, Sloane murmured as they approached the bar. Everyone's watching. Everyone sees what you've built. She was right. This was his night. The Meridian deal had been announced just 3 days ago, and the business community was still buzzing. It had been a masterwork of negotiation, identifying the vulnerabilities in Meridian's capital structure, leveraging relationships Sloane's family had cultivated for generations, and timing the approach with surgical precision. Some people called it aggressive. Grant called it efficient. The bartender handed him a scotch, Sloane a gin martini. They turned to survey the room together, a united front of ambition and achievement. There's something beautiful about this, Grant said quietly. About reaching the point where you don't have to prove yourself anymore, where your presence alone is the proof. Sloane's lips curved into a smile. Don't get too comfortable. There's always someone hungry coming up behind you. Let them try. But even as he said it, Grant felt a strange prickle of unease, the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched, studied, assessed. He scanned the room again, slower this time, trying to identify the source. Nothing. Just the usual crowd of power players and social climbers, everyone performing their roles in the grand theater of influence. He was being paranoid. Claire Hanley was a ghost from a past that didn't matter anymore. Hearing her name had just thrown him off balance for a moment, reminded him of debts he'd already paid and bridges he'd already burned. The evening progressed with its predictable rhythm. Dinner was announced, some elaborately plated fusion cuisine that prioritized presentation over substance. Grant found himself seated at a table with 2 venture capitalists, a state senator, and the CEO of a pharmaceutical company that had just gone public. The conversation flowed around topics of interest rates, regulatory challenges, and the upcoming mayoral race. Sloane held court at the opposite end of the table, charming the senator's wife and laughing at the pharmaceutical CEO's attempts at humor. She was better at this than Grant was, better at making people feel special, making them believe they were the only person in the room that mattered. It was a skill he'd tried to teach Claire, back when he'd still believed she could grow into the role he'd needed her to play. But Claire had never been comfortable with performance, with the careful dance of flattery and positioning that defined this world. She'd always been too earnest, too focused on the work itself rather than the perception of the work. It had been one of many incompatibilities that had made their eventual separation inevitable. Dessert arrived, something involving chocolate and gold leaf, and the evening's program began. The charity's director took the stage to thank everyone for their generous contributions, reading off names and donation amounts with the reverence usually reserved for religious texts. Grant and Sloan had contributed $50,000, enough to be mentioned in the second tier of recognition, visible but not ostentatious. As the applause rippled through the room, Grant felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He ignored it. Whatever it was could wait until tomorrow. The director introduced the evening's keynote speaker, some entrepreneur who'd made a fortune in renewable energy and now spent his time telling other people how to be successful. Grant half listened, his attention drifting again to the crowd, to the subtle dynamics of who sat with whom, who made eye contact across the room, who left early, and who stayed late. He was mapping the landscape of power the way he always did, looking for opportunities, identifying threats, calculating angles. And then the energy in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, just a ripple of movement near the main entrance, heads turning, conversations pausing mid-sentence. Grant felt Sloan stiffen beside him, her hand reaching for his arm. "What's going on?" she whispered. Grant followed the collective gaze toward the ballroom entrance and felt his heart rate spike. A security detail had entered, not the usual event security in ill-fitting blazers, but professionals. 6 of them, moving with military precision, their earpieces visible, their suits cut to accommodate weapons. They moved through the crowd with calm authority, creating a corridor from the entrance to the center of the room. The room had gone almost silent now, the kind of silence that happens when power announces itself without words. And then he appeared. Damian Cross was not a man who made public appearances. The tech billionaire had built his fortune in artificial intelligence and data analytics, creating systems that predicted market movements, optimized supply chains, and exposed inefficiencies that cost companies millions. He was famously reclusive, conducting business through encrypted channels and proxy representatives, appearing in person only when absolutely necessary. His presence at a charity gala in Asteria City was unprecedented, shocking, historic. Cross was younger than Grant expected, mid-40s perhaps, with dark hair graying at the temples and sharp features that suggested both intelligence and ruthlessness. He wore a simple black suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and he moved with the contained energy of someone who had nothing to prove. The security detail had created space in the center of the room, and Cross stood there for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd with what looked like faint amusement. Grant felt Sloane's fingers dig into his arm. "Why is he here?" she breathed. Before Grant could respond, Cross did something that made the room collectively hold its breath. He offered his hand to someone. A woman stepped forward from the edge of the security perimeter, and Grant's world tilted on its axis. She wore a sapphire gown that was simultaneously elegant and commanding, the kind of dress that didn't scream for attention but demanded it anyway. Her dark hair was swept back in a style that exposed the clean lines of her face, and she moved with a confidence that seemed to bend the light around her. Grant's scotch glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the table with a dull thud. Because the woman taking Damian Cross's hand, the woman who looked like power incarnate, the woman who commanded the attention of every person in the ballroom, was Claire. His Claire. Except she wasn't his anymore. She wasn't anyone's. She was something else entirely. "Is that—" Sloan started, but her voice died as Claire and Cross moved through the room together, conversation stopping in their wake like a wave breaking against stone. Grant's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. Claire was supposed to be struggling, working at some small firm, trying to rebuild a career he'd systematically destroyed. She was supposed to be a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when you didn't have what it took to survive at the top. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to look like that. She wasn't supposed to be standing beside the most powerful tech billionaire in the country like she belonged there. Claire's eyes swept across the room, and for just a fraction of a second, they landed on Grant. There was no anger there, no pain, no satisfaction. Just a cool, assessing gaze that looked at him the way you might look at a stranger on the street, briefly, with mild disinterest, before moving on to something more important. It was that indifference that hit him harder than anything else could have. "Grant," Sloan hissed, her voice tight with something that might have been fear. "What is going on? How does she know Damian Cross?" "I don't know," Grant managed, his throat dry. "I have no idea." But even as he said it, pieces were starting to click together in his mind. fragments of information he'd dismissed as irrelevant suddenly reforming into a pattern he should have seen. 3 months ago, a boutique consulting firm called Ethon Analytics had appeared on the scene, taking on high-profile clients with unusual speed. Grant had barely paid attention. Small firms came and went all the time, and unless they were direct competitors, they didn't matter. 6 weeks ago, Meridian Capital had experienced some unusual trading patterns. Nothing illegal, but definitely irregular. Grant's team had investigated and found nothing concerning, just market volatility. 2 weeks ago, several of Meridian's smaller institutional investors had quietly sold their positions. Again, Grant's team had investigated and found reasonable explanations: portfolio rebalancing, risk management, normal business. But now, watching Claire stand beside Damian Cross like she'd always belonged in rooms like this, Grant felt the first cold finger of real fear trace down his spine. Cross raised his hand, a casual gesture that somehow commanded absolute silence. The keynote speaker had stopped mid-sentence, recognizing that he was no longer the most important person in the room. "Good evening," Cross said, his voice carrying easily despite not being amplified. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. I'm not usually one for public gatherings, but tonight required an exception." He glanced at Claire, something that might have been a smile touching his lips. "Some of you may know Claire Hanley. Some of you may have forgotten her, which was precisely what she was counting on." Grant felt his chest tighten. Beside him, Sloane had gone very still, her knuckles white against her champagne flute. "Ms. Hanley came to me 18 months ago with something remarkable," Cross continued, his gaze now sweeping across the room with predatory focus. "A market intelligence system she'd designed called Oracle. It was elegant, sophisticated, and revealed patterns that even my own systems had missed." Claire stepped forward slightly, her voice calm and clear. "Oracle doesn't predict the future. It reveals the present that people work very hard to hide. Hidden leverage, undisclosed relationships, structural weaknesses disguised as strengths." Grant's heart was pounding now, his mind racing through every deal he'd made, every corner he'd cut, every relationship he'd leveraged. "When Claire showed me what Oracle could do," Cross said, "I saw an opportunity. Not just for profit, though there was certainly that, but for something more interesting: accountability." He paused, letting the word hang in the air like a blade. "Over the past 14 months, Ms. Hanley and I have been conducting a very specific kind of acquisition. We've been buying debt, small pieces at first, through shell companies and proxy investors. Nothing illegal, nothing even unusual, just patient, methodical accumulation." Sloane's hand found Grant's under the table, gripping it with desperate strength. "The debt we've been acquiring belongs to Meridian Capital," Cross said, and the room erupted in shocked murmurs. Or more precisely, to the web of subsidiaries, shell companies, and offshore entities that make up Meridian's real capital structure. Grant felt the floor drop out from under him. His mind flashed to every document he'd signed, every assurance he'd been given by Meridian's legal team, every guarantee that the partnership was secure. Claire's voice cut through the rising noise like a knife. "As of 4 p.m. today, Mr. Cross and I control sufficient debt and equity positions to exercise majority ownership of Meridian Capital. The paperwork has been filed with the appropriate regulatory agencies. The transfer is legal, binding, and complete." The ballroom exploded into chaos, voices rising, phones appearing despite the no-device policy, people standing and demanding explanations. Cross raised his hand again, and somehow the room quieted. "Tomorrow morning, Ms. Hanley will be announced as Meridian Capital's new CEO. Her first act will be to initiate a comprehensive audit of every division, every partnership, every deal that's been made under the previous leadership." His eyes found Grant across the room, and the smile that crossed his face was not kind. "We'll be particularly interested in examining partnerships that were built on concealed conflicts of interest, undisclosed personal relationships, and creative interpretations of fiduciary duty." Grant couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room was spinning, and Sloane was saying something, but he couldn't hear her over the roaring in his ears. Claire looked at him again, and this time she held his gaze for a long moment. When she spoke, her words were for the room, but Grant knew they were meant for him. "For those wondering about my qualifications, I spent 7 years building analytical models and investment frameworks for a small firm that's since grown considerably. I learned everything I know about finding weakness in capital structures from a very thorough teacher. I learned about identifying leverage points from someone who believed that winning was the only thing that mattered. Her voice didn't waver, didn't break. I learned about ruthlessness from an expert, and then I became better at it than he ever was. The words hit Grant like physical blows. Around him, he could feel the shift in the room. People looking at him now, making connections, remembering his divorce, remembering the ruthless way he'd dismantled Claire's claims to their shared business. Jonathan Wexler was staring at him from across the room, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes calculating. Marcus Chen was typing furiously on his phone, no doubt already drafting the story that would run in tomorrow's business section. And Sloane was looking at him like he was a stranger who'd just destroyed her life. "You need to fix this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Right now, call your lawyers, call my father, fix this, Grant." But Grant knew, with the terrible clarity of a man watching his empire crumble, that this couldn't be fixed. Claire hadn't made a mistake, she hadn't left an opening. She'd spent 18 months building a trap so perfect, so legally airtight, that there was no escape. Cross was speaking again, explaining the timeline for the transition, the leadership changes that would take effect immediately, the investigations that would begin Monday morning. Grant forced himself to focus, to listen, to understand the full scope of what was happening. "Several executives will be asked to resign pending the outcome of the audit," Cross was saying. "Others will be terminated immediately for cause. Hanley has identified systematic patterns of self-dealing, conflicts of interest, and fiduciary violations that cannot be allowed to continue." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "I have here a preliminary list of individuals whose employment with Meridian Capital will be terminated effective immediately." The room held its breath. "Grant Harlow," Cross read, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Chief Strategy Officer, terminated for cause. Pending investigation into undisclosed personal relationships affecting business decisions, specifically the concealment of familial connections to vendors and partners." The words kept coming, but Grant couldn't hear them anymore. Someone was screaming. He thought it might be Sloane. And security was moving toward him. Not the event security, but Cross's people. Professional and implacable. He stood on autopilot, his body responding to commands his brain hadn't consciously given. Around him, the ballroom had descended into controlled chaos, some people trying to leave, others pressing forward for a better view, everyone talking at once. Grant looked for Claire through the crowd and found her watching him. Their eyes met across the distance of the ballroom, across the years of marriage and divorce and destruction. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't show any emotion at all. She just looked at him the way you might look at a chapter you'd finished reading, with mild curiosity about how it had ended, and relief that it was finally over. "Sir?" one of the security officers said, his hand gentle but firm on Grant's elbow. "This way, please." "I can walk," Grant heard himself say. "I don't need to be escorted like a criminal." "Protocol, sir," the officer replied, unmoved. They guided him through the crowd, which parted with the same curious, vicious energy that people show at traffic accidents. Grant kept his eyes forward, his expression as neutral as he could manage, trying to hold on to some shred of dignity. He could hear Sloane behind him, her voice rising in pitch as she argued with someone, probably trying to use her family's name, her connections, her influence to make this go away. She didn't understand yet. This wasn't something that could be made to go away. Claire had been thorough. Claire had been patient. Claire had learned from the best teacher she could have had, from Grant himself, and then she'd surpassed him. They led him through a service corridor that smelled of industrial cleaner and catering food. The contrast to the gilded ballroom was jarring, concrete floors and fluorescent lights, and the kind of unglamorous reality that existed behind every beautiful facade. Grant's phone was buzzing constantly now. Calls, texts, probably his lawyers trying to reach him, his partners demanding explanations. The security officer stopped at an exit that led to the hotel's loading area. "Someone will bring your coat and personal effects," he said. "A car will arrive shortly to take you home." "I drove," Grant said numbly. "Your vehicle will be delivered tomorrow." The officer's voice was professional, but held a note of something that might have been pity. "I'd recommend against driving tonight, sir." The door opened, and Grant stepped out into the cold March night. The loading area was deserted except for a few catering vans and the distant sound of traffic. He stood there in his $1,000 tuxedo, in an alley behind the most prestigious hotel in Asteria City, and tried to understand how his life had unraveled so completely in the span of 30 minutes. His phone buzzed again. This time he looked at it. Marcus Chen. "Grant, I need a statement for tomorrow's story. Call me ASAP." His business partner, David. "What the hell is happening? The board is demanding answers." Sloan. "Where are you? We need to talk to Daddy's lawyers right now." And then a number he didn't recognize. "I'm sorry it came to this, but you taught me that sometimes the only way forward is through." C. Grant stared at the message for a long time, his fingers numb despite the relative warmth of the evening. He wanted to text back something cutting, something that would hurt her the way she'd hurt him. But what could he possibly say? What words could touch someone who'd just executed the most sophisticated corporate takedown he'd ever witnessed? Instead, he stood in the alley and let himself remember. Claire, 26 years old, earnest and brilliant and so ready to believe in him. Working weekends without complaint, building models that made his pitches sing, believing that they were partners in every sense of the word. Claire, crying in the courthouse, trying to explain to a judge why she deserved half of something she'd helped build from nothing. Claire, walking away with almost nothing, her shoulders straight despite everything he'd taken from her. And now Claire, standing in a ballroom full of the city's elite, holding the power to destroy everything he'd become. The car arrived, a black town car with tinted windows. The driver got out, opened the rear door, waited with practiced patience. Grant climbed in, and as the car pulled away from the hotel, he turned to look back at the building. Through the tall windows, he could see the ballroom still blazing with light. The party was continuing, life moving forward without him. The business community already adapting to this new reality where Claire Hanley was the person who mattered, and Grant Harlow was yesterday's news. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts, looking for someone who could help, someone who could fix this, someone who could make it all go back to the way it was supposed to be. But with each name he considered, he realized the truth he'd been avoiding. There was no fixing this. Claire had won, completely, utterly, irreversibly. And the worst part, the part that made his chest tight and his eyes burn, was that she'd won using every lesson he'd ever taught her about power, leverage, and the ruthless pursuit of victory. She'd become exactly what he'd always needed her to be. She just hadn't done it for him. The car drove through the empty streets of Asteria City, past the office buildings where Grant had built his reputation, past the restaurants where he'd closed deals, past the life he'd constructed so carefully over so many years. And for the first time since he'd walked away from his marriage, Grant Harlow understood the true cost of winning at any price. It wasn't that you lost things. It was that the things you lost eventually learned how to win without you. The town car dropped Grant at his penthouse in the Ashford Tower, the building where he and Sloan had moved after their wedding, all glass and steel and views that stretched across Asteria City like a kingdom he'd thought he owned. The doorman's expression was carefully neutral as he held the door, but Grant caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Knowledge. The story was already spreading. Grant rode the elevator to the 42nd floor in silence, his reflection staring back at him from the polished brass doors. He looked the same as he had 3 hours ago, same tuxedo, same haircut, same face, but everything else had changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. The penthouse was dark and empty. Sloan hadn't come home yet, probably still at the hotel, trying to do damage control with her family's connections, calling in favors that Grant suspected wouldn't matter anymore. He poured himself a scotch and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere down there, Claire was probably celebrating. Or maybe not. Maybe she was already working, planning her next moves, thinking 3 steps ahead the way she always had, the way he'd never appreciated until it was too late. His phone buzzed again. He'd turned off most notifications, but his lawyer had override access. "Grant, we need to talk. Tonight. Don't make any statements to anyone until we've spoken." Grant texted back, "Tomorrow. I need to think." "This can't wait until tomorrow. They're going to move fast. We need to be faster." But Grant knew better. Claire hadn't left any openings. If there had been a way to fight this, she would have anticipated it and closed it off months ago. She'd learned thoroughness from him, after all. He thought back to the early days of their relationship, before the marriage, before the business really took off. They'd met at a financial modeling workshop, one of those continuing education things that young professionals attended to network and pad their resumes. Claire had been presenting a case study on detecting fraud patterns in commercial real estate transactions, and Grant had been struck by the elegance of her approach. He'd asked her to coffee afterward, then dinner. Then he'd hired her as his first real employee, paying her barely enough to cover rent, but promising her equity, partnership, a share in something that would be worth the sacrifice. She'd believed him, completely, without reservation. And for a while, it had been good. They'd worked 18-hour days together, building financial models that helped small businesses secure funding, crafting pitch decks that turned skeptical investors into believers. Claire had a gift for finding the story in the numbers, for making data sing in ways that moved people to action. Grant had provided the vision, the ambition, the willingness to push harder than anyone else. Together, they'd been formidable. The marriage had been practical at first: health insurance, tax benefits, the stability that investors like to see. But somewhere in those early years, Grant had convinced himself it was also real, that they were partners in every sense, that Claire understood him in ways no one else could. The divorce had cured him of that delusion. When the business started to really take off, when the clients got bigger and the stakes got higher, Grant had realized that Claire didn't fit the image he needed to project. She was brilliant with data, but awkward at client dinners. She could build a financial model that would make a CFO weep, but she couldn't charm a room full of investors the way he needed. And then he'd met Sloane at a fundraiser for the Asteria Museum of Art. Sloane, who moved through rooms like she owned them, who had the right last name and the right connections and the right instincts for the social chess game that Grant was learning to play. The decision had been easy, in retrospect. Business was about optimization, about putting the right pieces in the right places. Claire was a liability he could no longer afford. His lawyers had made it brutal because he'd told them to. Bury her in motions, delay hearings, force her to spend money she didn't have fighting for assets he would never let her claim. Make it painful enough that she'd accept whatever settlement he offered just to make it stop. It had worked. Claire had settled for almost nothing, a small payout that wouldn't even cover her legal fees, and a non-disparagement agreement that prevented her from talking about what he'd done. Grant had walked away with the business, the assets, the future. Claire had walked away with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge of how to build financial models that could change the world. He should have paid more attention to that second part. The penthouse door slammed open, and Sloane swept in like a storm front, still in her gown, her face flushed with anger and something that looked like fear. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "I've been calling for an hour." "Thinking," Grant said, not turning from the window. "Thinking?" "We don't have time for thinking. We need to act. Daddy's lawyers are already working on options. There has to be a way to challenge this, some kind of procedural violation, or—" "There isn't," Grant said quietly. She didn't make mistakes. Sloane stared at him, her chest heaving. "You're giving up? Just like that? Do you have any idea what this means for us? For my family?" Meridian Capital is a cornerstone investment for half of Daddy's portfolio. If that woman starts an audit— "Her name is Claire," Grant said, finally turning to face his wife. "And she knows exactly what she's doing. She spent 18 months building this play. She had Damian Cross backing her, which means she had unlimited resources and the best legal team money can buy. If there was a flaw in her strategy, she found it and fixed it before we ever knew she was coming." Sloane's face had gone pale beneath her makeup. "How long were you married to her?" 7 years. "And you never thought to mention that your ex-wife was some kind of financial genius?" Grant laughed, the sound bitter in his throat. "She wasn't. When we divorced, she was broken, barely functional, working at a boutique firm making $40,000 a year. I destroyed her, Sloane, completely. Or at least, I thought I did." "Well, clearly you didn't destroy her enough," Sloane snapped, "because she just destroyed us." The words hung in the air between them, ugly and true. Grant's phone rang. His business partner David probably calling for the 5th time that hour. Grant ignored it. "You need to answer that," Sloane said. "You need to start controlling this narrative before it controls you." "The narrative is already gone," Grant replied. "By tomorrow morning, every business journalist in the city will be running stories about the ruthless deal maker who got taken down by the wife he discarded. It's perfect. It's poetic. And there's not a damn thing I can do to change it." Sloan grabbed his phone off the coffee table and thrust it at him. Call Daddy, now. He has connections at the regulatory agencies. Maybe we can slow down the transfer, create space to negotiate. Negotiate what? Grant's voice rose despite himself. She owns the debt. She owns the equity. She has legal majority control. Your father's connections don't mean anything when the paperwork is clean. Then fight her in the press. Destroy her credibility. You know things about her, right? Weaknesses? Secrets? Grant looked at his wife and saw, for the first time, the desperation beneath her polished exterior. Sloan had built her identity around being on the winning team, around the Mercer name and the power it commanded. The idea that she might lose, that she might be associated with failure, was existential terror for her. I don't have anything on Claire, he said slowly. She doesn't have weaknesses, or if she does, I never found them. She was always good, honest, ethical to a fault. Then make something up. The words dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Grant stared at Sloan, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. You want me to lie about her? Fabricate accusations? I want you to do whatever it takes to fix this, Sloan said, her voice hard. Isn't that what you always told me? That winning is the only thing that matters? That you do whatever it takes? She was quoting him. His own words, his own philosophy, thrown back in his face. I can't, Grant said quietly. You can't or you won't. Both. He set his scotch down on the granite counter, the glass making a sharp sound in the quiet penthouse. If I attack Claire publicly, she'll respond. And whatever she has, whatever evidence she's been sitting on for 18 months, it will be worse than anything I could make up. Sloane's phone buzzed. She looked at it, and her expression shifted to something close to panic. It's Mother. She's already heard. She answered, her voice instantly transforming into something placating and smooth. Mother, I know. We're handling it. Daddy's lawyers are… Yes, I understand. Of course. Tomorrow morning, I'll be there. She ended the call and looked at Grant with eyes that had gone cold. My parents want to see us. Both of us. Tomorrow at 9. To discuss what? Damage control. Asset protection. How we're going to separate the Mercer family holdings from this disaster. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. They're talking about an annulment. The word hit Grant harder than he expected. We've been married for 2 years, and in those 2 years you failed to disclose a significant liability from your previous marriage. That constitutes fraud in the inducement, according to Mother's attorney. Grant wanted to laugh, wanted to point out the hypocrisy of the Mercer family, who had built their fortune on creative interpretations of contract law and strategic relationship management. But he was too tired, and he understood the game too well. The Mercers were cutting their losses. He was the loss. Fine, he said. 9 o'clock. I'll be there. Sloan studied him for a long moment, and something like disappointment flickered across her face. You're not even going to fight, are you? You're just going to let her win. She already won, Sloan. Everything after this is just aftermath. His wife turned and walked toward the bedroom, her heels clicking against the marble floor. At the doorway, she paused. I thought you were different, smarter, stronger. I thought you were someone who didn't lose. I thought I was too, Grant said quietly. After she left, Grant stood alone in the penthouse that suddenly felt like a museum of someone else's life. The modern furniture, the abstract art, the designer everything, it all belonged to a version of Grant Harlow who had existed 3 hours ago. He pulled out his laptop and did what he should have done years ago. He searched for Claire Hanley. The results were sparse at first. A LinkedIn profile that listed her as strategic consultant at Ethan Analytics for the past 18 months. Before that, a 3-year gap. Before that, her role at his firm, listed simply as financial analyst. But when he dug deeper, using the research techniques he'd learned in his MBA program and refined over years of due diligence, a pattern began to emerge. Ethon Analytics had been founded 20 months ago with undisclosed private funding. It had taken on exactly 7 clients, all of them mid-sized firms with complex capital structures. And in every single case, those clients had shown remarkable improvement in operational efficiency within 6 months of engaging Ethon services. Grant pulled up the client list and felt his blood run cold. Three of them were Meridian Capital subsidiaries. Claire had been inside Meridian's operations for over a year with full access to their books, their systems, their vulnerabilities. She hadn't just been planning this takeover, she'd been running reconnaissance, mapping every weakness, identifying every point of leverage. While he'd been congratulating himself on the Meridian partnership, Claire had been systematically learning how to take it apart. Grant kept digging, following digital breadcrumbs through corporate registrations and SEC filings. The shell companies that had been buying Meridian's debt were registered in Delaware and Nevada, using layers of legal entities that made tracing ownership nearly impossible. But the timing gave it away. They'd all been established within a 3-month window, right after Claire had founded Aethon. She'd been building this for almost 2 years. While he'd been celebrating his new marriage, his new connections, his rise through Asteria City's power structure, Claire had been constructing the trap that would destroy it all. The worst part was the elegance of it. Grant had spent his career studying sophisticated financial plays, and Claire's takeover was a masterpiece. She'd used his own tactics against him: patience, precision, and the willingness to spend years setting up a single perfect move. His phone buzzed with a call from Marcus Chen. Grant stared at it, then answered. "Marcus?" "Grant, I need a quote for tomorrow's story. The narrative is forming with or without your input, and right now it's not favorable." "What's the narrative?" Ambitious dealmaker gets taken down by the brilliant wife he exploited and discarded. It's got everything: betrayal, revenge, gender dynamics, corporate intrigue. It's going to run above the fold with full analysis. And if I give you a quote, then you at least get to shape your side of it. But Grant, Marcus paused. "Whatever you say, it better be true. I've got 3 sources confirming that you used legal warfare to force Claire into an unfair settlement. If you try to spin that, I'll bury you." Grant closed his eyes. Marcus was a friend, or as close to a friend as Grant had in the journalism world. But he was a journalist first, and this story was too big to let friendship get in the way. "Tell them I have no comment at this time," Grant said. "That's not going to help you." "I know." After he hung up, Grant poured another scotch and returned to his research. He found Claire's graduate thesis from MIT, a dense, brilliant analysis of pattern recognition in financial fraud. He found a presentation she'd given at a fintech conference 4 years ago, before the divorce, talking about using AI to detect market manipulation. He found the foundation for Oracle, the system she'd built to take him down. And he found something else. A filing with the Patent Office, dated 6 months before their divorce, listing Claire Hanley as the sole inventor of a method and system for automated detection of structural vulnerabilities in complex financial entities. She'd started building Oracle while they were still married. While he'd been planning to leave her, she'd been creating the weapon she'd eventually use to destroy him. Had she known? Had she seen it coming and started preparing her defense? Or had she always been building something brilliant, and he'd just been too blind to see it? Grant's phone lit up with a text from a number he didn't recognize. "The audit begins Monday. I need your full cooperation with the transition team. Professional courtesy, nothing more. C." He stared at the message, his finger hovering over the keyboard. 1,000 responses ran through his mind, from pleading to threatening to simply asking why. Instead, he typed, "I'll cooperate. For what it's worth, I'm sorry." The response came back almost immediately. "You're sorry you got caught. There's a difference." Grant flinched. She wasn't wrong. "I'm sorry for what I did to you," he wrote. "For how I did it. You deserved better." This time the response took longer. When it came, it was just 4 words. "Yes, I did. Goodbye, Grant." He sat there in his penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of success he'd built on the ruins of his first marriage, and finally let himself feel the full weight of what he'd lost. Not the career, though that hurt. Not the reputation, though that stung. Not even the marriage to Sloane, which he was beginning to suspect had always been more transaction than relationship. What he'd lost was the person who had believed in him before anyone else did. The person who had seen his potential when he was nobody, who had worked beside him through the brutal early years, who had never asked for credit or recognition, just partnership. He'd thrown that away because she didn't fit the image of success he wanted to project, because she wasn't polished enough, connected enough, strategic enough, and she'd gone away and become all those things without him, better than him, smarter than him, more patient, more thorough, more willing to play the long game. Grant pulled up security footage from the gala on his phone. Someone had already posted clips to social media because of course they had. He watched Claire step forward to take Damien Cross's hand, watched her move through the crowd with confidence that looked effortless but must have taken years to build. She'd reinvented herself completely. Not to prove something to him, he doubted he'd crossed her mind except as a problem to be solved, but because she'd had to. Because he'd left her no choice except to become stronger or be destroyed. She'd chosen strength. The bedroom door opened, and Sloane emerged in pajamas, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. She looked younger without it, more vulnerable, and for a moment Grant felt a flash of genuine affection for her. "I'm sleeping in the guest room," she said quietly. "Mother thinks it's better if we maintain some distance until the lawyers figure out the annulment details." "Sloane, don't." She held up a hand. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just tired. This whole thing is exhausting, and I need to protect myself. You understand that, right? It's just good strategy." Grant nodded slowly. "I understand." "For what it's worth," Sloane said, "I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who wanted to win so badly that you forgot to consider the cost. And now the bill is due." She disappeared into the guest room, and Grant was alone again with his laptop and his scotch, and the growing realization that everything he'd built his identity around was dissolving like sugar in water. He worked through the night, reading everything he could find about Claire's transformation. He found mentions of her in tech industry publications, always in the background, always credited as a consultant or advisor rather than a principal. She'd been building her network quietly, deliberately, staying below the radar until she was ready to strike. At 4 a.m, Grant found an interview with Damien Cross from 6 months ago. The journalist had asked about his investment strategy, and Cross had said something that made Grant's chest tighten. "I look for people who have been underestimated. There's a special kind of hunger in someone who's been dismissed, who's been told they're not enough. When you find that person and they're also brilliant, you don't just have a good investment, you have a weapon." Claire had been his weapon, and Grant had been the target. As dawn broke over Asteria City, Grant stood at the windows again, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. In a few hours, he'd go meet with the Mercers and discuss the dissolution of his marriage. Then he'd face his business partners and watch them calculate whether he was still an asset or had become a liability. And somewhere in the city, Claire was probably already at work, preparing to take control of Meridian Capital, ready to tear apart the empire that had been built on foundations she'd helped lay. Grant's phone buzzed one more time. David, his business partner, with a message that was blunt and brutal. "Board meeting at noon. Bring your lawyer. We need to discuss your future with the firm." Grant knew what that meant. He'd been in enough of those meetings from the other side. They were going to ask him to step down, to remove himself from client-facing roles, to become a liability they managed rather than a partner they valued. The transformation from winner to cautionary tale was happening faster than he'd imagined possible. He showered and dressed in one of his best suits, armor for the battles ahead, even if he knew he was going to lose them all. As he knotted his tie, he caught sight of himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Grant Harlow, the ruthless dealmaker, looked exhausted, looked defeated, looked like someone who'd forgotten the most important rule of strategy, that every action has consequences, and sometimes those consequences take years to arrive. He thought about texting Claire one more time, asking her if this was enough, if she was satisfied with the destruction she'd wrought. But he already knew the answer. This wasn't about satisfaction for her. This was about justice, about reclaiming what had been taken, about proving that she could survive and thrive despite everything he'd done to break her. And she had proven it, definitively, irrevocably. Grant grabbed his briefcase and headed for the elevator, ready to face the Mercers and their lawyers and the systematic dismantling of the life he'd built. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Grant realized that the worst part wasn't the loss itself. It was the knowledge that Claire had been right there all along, with all the tools and skills and brilliance she'd needed to be his true partner. And he'd thrown her away because she didn't look like success. Now she was success, and he was the one being discarded. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, where a small crowd of reporters had already gathered, cameras ready, questions prepared. Grant took a breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked into the aftermath of his own destruction with as much dignity as he could manage. Because if he'd learned anything from Claire, it was that how you handled losing mattered just as much as how you handled winning. Maybe more. The reporters surged forward as Grant stepped out of the elevator, their questions overlapping into an incomprehensible wall of noise. Microphones thrust toward his face, camera flashes creating bursts of white light that made his eyes water. Mr. Harlow, is it true you concealed assets during your divorce? Grant, how does it feel to be taken down by your ex-wife? Did you know Claire Hanley was planning this takeover? Grant kept his expression neutral, his stride steady as he pushed through the crowd toward the exit. His driver was waiting at the curb, thank heaven, the car door already open. Grant slid inside and the door shut, muffling the shouted questions to a dull roar. The Mercer residence, Grant said, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. The driver nodded and pulled into traffic. Grant closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for what was coming, but his mind kept circling back to that moment at the gala when Claire had looked at him with such perfect indifference, like he was a stranger, like he was nobody. The Mercer estate occupied 5 acres in Greystone Heights, the old money enclave where Asteria City's founding families had built their mansions a century ago. The house was Georgian colonial, all white columns and symmetry, designed to project permanence and unassailable respectability. Grant had always felt like an intruder here, despite being family by marriage. The Mercers had tolerated him because he was useful, because his deal-making prowess had generated returns for their portfolio, because Sloan had wanted him. But tolerance wasn't the same as acceptance, and he'd always known it. The butler, an older man named Harrison, who'd been with the family for 30 years, opened the door with his usual impeccable politeness. But Grant caught the flicker of something in his eyes, too. Pity, maybe, or satisfaction at seeing the upstart brought low. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer are waiting in the study, Harrison said. Miss Sloan is already with them. Grant followed him through the marble-floored foyer, past oil paintings of Mercer ancestors who stared down with painted disapproval. The study was a temple to masculine power, leather furniture, dark wood paneling, shelves lined with first editions that no one actually read. Richard Mercer stood by the fireplace, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand despite the early hour. He was 63 but looked 50, with silver hair and the kind of assured bearing that came from never having to question your place in the world. Sloane's mother, Patricia, sat in a wingback chair, her posture perfect, her expression carved from ice. Sloane stood near the window, still in the clothes she'd worn home from the gala, her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. Grant, Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of pronouncement. Sit down. Grant sat in the chair opposite Patricia, feeling like a defendant at trial. In a way, he supposed he was. Richard took a long sip of his drink before speaking. I've spent the past 6 hours on the phone with our legal team, our financial advisors, and several board members of companies where we hold significant positions. The consensus is unanimous. This situation is a catastrophe. I understand that, Grant began, but Richard cut him off with a raised hand. Do you? Do you truly understand the magnitude of what's happened? Meridian Capital manages $42 billion in assets. The Mercer family portfolio has 17% exposure to Meridian-related investments. Your ex-wife now controls that entity, and she's announced her intention to conduct a comprehensive audit of every transaction, every relationship, every deal made under the previous leadership. Patricia's voice was cold and precise. Our attorneys inform us that several of those deals involved relationships that could be considered conflicts of interest if examined with sufficient scrutiny. Relationships that you facilitated, Grant, using your marriage to our daughter as leverage. Grant felt his jaw tighten. Everything I did was legal. Aggressive, maybe, but legal. Legal and ethical aren't the same thing, Richard said. And in the current environment, with your ex-wife holding all the cards and considerable public sympathy, the distinction doesn't matter. She can make our lives very difficult if she chooses to, and given what you did to her, I suspect she'll choose exactly that. Sloane finally spoke, her voice small and strained. Can't we negotiate with her? Offer her something to make this go away? Richard's laugh was bitter. Negotiate? With what? She has Damian Cross backing her, which means she has unlimited resources. She has legal majority control of Meridian, which means she has leverage over half the power structure in this city. And she has the moral high ground, which in this political climate is worth more than both of those things combined. He turned to Grant. his expression hardening. Tell me something. Tell me. When you divorced Claire Hanley, did it occur to you that destroying her so completely might come back to haunt you? Grant met his eyes. At the time, I thought I was doing what was necessary to protect the business. You were protecting your ego, Patricia said sharply. You wanted to punish her for not being what you needed her to be. And now we're all paying the price for your vindictiveness. The words stung because they were true. Grant had told himself the divorce was about business, about optimization, about putting the right pieces in the right places. But underneath all that rationalization, there had been anger. Resentment that Claire couldn't transform herself into the kind of wife his new life required. Bitterness that she'd had the audacity to fight for what she'd helped build. He'd wanted to break her. And he had. He just hadn't considered what she might become after she put herself back together. Richard set his glass down with a heavy thud. Here's what's going to happen. Our attorneys have prepared annulment papers based on fraudulent inducement. You failed to disclose a significant liability from your previous marriage, namely that your ex-wife possessed both the capability and apparent motivation to destroy your career. Sloan will sign them this morning. You'll sign them by end of business today. And if I refuse? Grant asked, already knowing the answer. Then we'll pursue a contested divorce that will make your first one look gentle by comparison, Patricia said. We'll freeze joint assets, challenge every penny you've earned during the marriage, and drag this process out until you've spent every dollar you have on legal fees. The annulment is mercy, Grant. I suggest you take it. Sloan was crying now, silent tears tracking down her face. Grant wanted to feel something for her, sympathy, regret, connection. But all he felt was numbness and the distant recognition that this marriage had always been a transaction that had finally failed to generate returns. I'll sign, Grant said quietly. Richard nodded, satisfied. Smart choice. Harrison will provide you with the documents. Our attorneys have also prepared a statement for the press indicating that the marriage is being dissolved by mutual agreement due to irreconcilable differences. You'll make no other public comments about the Mercer family, Sloan, or the circumstances of the separation. In exchange, we'll refrain from discussing the details of your previous marriage. It was a gag order dressed up as courtesy. Grant was being silenced, bought off with the promise that the Mercers wouldn't make his situation worse than it already was. There's one more thing, Patricia said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. We've been informed that you're expected at a board meeting this afternoon regarding your position at Harlow and Associates. I want to be very clear about something, Grant. If your partners decide to remove you from the firm that bears your name, the Mercer family will support that decision. We will not use our influence to protect you. We will not make calls on your behalf. As of this moment, you are on your own. The finality in her voice made it real in a way nothing else had. The Mercers weren't just cutting ties, they were making sure everyone knew Grant was no longer under their protection. In the ecosystem of Asteria City power dynamics, he'd just been declared prey. Harrison appeared in the doorway with a leather portfolio. Grant signed the annulment papers without reading them, his hand steady despite the dissolution of his second marriage happening in the same room where he'd asked Richard's permission to marry Sloan 3 years ago. Different chair, different circumstances. Different Grant Harlow, though he wasn't sure if he'd gotten better or worse. The car will take you wherever you need to go, Richard said, the dismissal clear in his tone. Sloan will collect her belongings from the penthouse this week. I trust you'll make that process as smooth as possible. Grant stood, looking one last time at the woman he'd married because she represented everything he'd thought he wanted. Sloan wouldn't meet his eyes. I'm sorry, he said, directing the words at her. For all of it. She finally looked up, her eyes red, but her voice steady. No, you're not. You're sorry you lost. There's a difference. The echo of Claire's words from the night before hit Grant like a physical blow. Both women, so different in almost every way, had arrived at the same conclusion about him. That his regret was performative, centered on his own losses rather than the harm he'd caused. Maybe they were right. Harrison escorted him back through the marble foyer, past the judgmental ancestors, out into the morning sunlight that felt too bright, too cheerful for the occasion. The car was waiting, and Grant climbed in without looking back at the house that would never welcome him again. Where to, sir? The driver asked. Grant checked his watch. 2 hours until the board meeting that would determine whether he still had a career. He needed to prepare, to strategize, to figure out how to salvage something from this disaster. "The office," he said. "Harlow and Associates." The drive-through morning traffic gave Grant time to think, though his thoughts kept spiraling back to the same impossible question. How had he missed it? How had Claire transformed herself so completely without him noticing? He'd been so focused on building his own empire that he'd never considered she might be building one too, brick by patient brick, aimed at his destruction. The Harlow and Associates offices occupied 3 floors of the Titanium Tower in the financial district. Grant had signed the lease 5 years ago when the firm had finally grown large enough to need real space, professional space, the kind of offices that impress clients and competitors alike. The reception area was empty when he arrived. The Saturday morning skeleton crew hadn't arrived yet. Grant took the elevator to the executive floor where his corner office looked out over the city he'd thought he was conquering. His computer was still logged in from Friday afternoon, back when the world had made sense. Grant pulled up the client files, the deal pipelines, the relationship maps that showed how every connection in the firm linked back to him. Except they didn't. Not anymore. He started making a list, forcing himself to be clinical about it. Which clients had come through Sloan's family connections? Which deals had been facilitated by the Mercer name? Which relationships would evaporate now that he was no longer family? The answer was devastating. Nearly 40% of the firm's business had Mercer fingerprints somewhere in the chain of custody. And that didn't even account for Meridian-related work, which was about to disappear entirely once Claire's audit began exposing the conflicts of interest that Grant had considered creative synergy. His office door opened without a knock. David Chen, his business partner and the firm's CFO, looked like he hadn't slept. His tie was loosened, his usually meticulous appearance disheveled, and his expression was thunderous. "We need to talk," David said, closing the door behind him. "Now. The board meeting isn't until noon. Forget the board meeting. I've been up all night with the accountants, going through every deal you've worked on in the past 2 years. Do you have any idea how exposed we are?" Grant felt his stomach drop. "What did you find?" David pulled out his tablet and started scrolling through spreadsheets. "The Meridian partnership that you were so proud of? It's built on at least 6 separate conflicts of interest. You used your relationship with Sloan to get preferential access to deal flow that should have gone through competitive bidding. You structured fees in ways that benefited you personally while increasing the firm's risk exposure. And you did it all without disclosing the personal relationships that made those deals possible. That's not illegal. No, but it's unethical as hell. And when Claire Hanley's audit team starts digging, they're going to find all of it. And when they do, every client is going to ask themselves whether they can trust a firm that operates that way." David's voice was tight with controlled fury. "You've made us all look dirty, Grant. Every lawyer, every analyst, every junior associate who's worked here, they're all going to have this stink on their resume." Grant wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Because David was right. In his rush to build bigger, close faster, win harder, Grant had cut corners and told himself that everyone did it, that this was just how business worked at the highest levels. But there was a difference between aggressive strategy and genuine conflict of interest, and Grant had crossed that line more times than he could count. "What does the board want to do?" Grant asked quietly. "The board wants you gone," David said bluntly. "Immediately. Before the audit starts, before the press digs deeper, before clients start asking questions we can't answer. This is my firm. My name is on the door. And that's the problem." David sat down heavily in one of the guest chairs. "Look, Grant, we've been partners for 8 years. I've watched you build this place from nothing. You're brilliant at what you do, when you're focused on the work instead of the optics. But somewhere along the way, you started believing your own mythology. You started thinking that winning justified everything, that the ends always justified the means." He pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. "This is a separation agreement. You'll step down as managing partner effective immediately. You'll retain a minority equity stake, but no operational control. Your name comes off the door and you make no public statements that could damage the firm's reputation. In exchange, we won't pursue legal action for the exposure you've created, and we'll structure your exit in a way that lets you keep some dignity." Grant stared at the document, the words blurring together. "And if I refuse?" "Then the board votes to remove you for cause, We claw back your partnership distributions for the past 2 years, and we make very sure that everyone knows exactly why you're being fired." David's voice softened slightly. "Take the deal, Grant. It's the best you're going to get." Grant picked up the pen on his desk, feeling its weight in his hand. This pen had signed hundreds of deals, thousands of documents, all the paperwork that had built his career. Now it would sign the document that ended it. He signed. David took the papers and stood to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. I know you poured everything into this place. But you forgot the first rule of sustainable success. You can't build an empire on foundations that won't hold up to scrutiny." After David left, Grant sat alone in his office for a long time, looking at the city spread out below him. Somewhere out there, Claire was probably in a conference room at Meridian Capital, meeting with attorneys and accountants, planning the systematic exposure of every questionable deal, every hidden relationship, every corner that had been cut. She would be thorough. She would be relentless. She would be everything he'd taught her to be. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Building security will escort you out at 11 a.m. Please have your personal effects packed by then." They weren't even letting him stay until the board meeting. The decision had already been made, and his presence was now a liability to be managed. Grant started packing his office, pulling down the awards and diplomas, the photos of deals closed and hands shaken. He found a picture of himself and Sloan at their wedding, both of them smiling for the camera, and wondered if either of them had ever actually been happy or if it had all been performance. At the back of a drawer, he found something that made him stop breathing. It was a photo from the early days, before the business took off, before the marriage fell apart. Grant and Claire at some cheap restaurant, celebrating their first big client contract. Claire was laughing at something, her face alight with genuine joy, and Grant was looking at her with an expression he barely recognized. Affection, pride, partnership. When had he stopped looking at her that way? When had she become an obstacle instead of an ally? Grant put the photo in his box with the rest of his personal effects and tried to remember the man he'd been in that picture. The man who'd believed in building something together, who'd valued loyalty and hard work, who'd thought success meant creating something meaningful rather than just accumulating wins. That man would have been horrified by what Grant had become. That man would have treated Claire like the asset she was, would have found a way to grow together instead of throwing her away. But that man hadn't wanted it badly enough, hadn't been hungry enough, hadn't been willing to do whatever it took. And maybe that was the tragedy, that becoming the kind of person who could win at the highest levels meant destroying the parts of yourself that would have made the winning meaningful. At 10:50, Grant carried his box to the elevator. The security guard who rode down with him was professional but distant, treating Grant like a potential threat rather than the man who'd signed his paychecks. The lobby was empty except for a young woman Grant recognized as one of the junior analysts. She looked up as he passed, her expression a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been satisfaction. The story was already spreading through the firm. By Monday, everyone would know that Grant Harlow had been forced out of the company that bore his name, disgraced and diminished. Grant's driver was waiting outside because the Mercers hadn't revoked that privilege yet. Small mercy, but he'd take it. "Where to, sir?" Grant was about to say the penthouse, then remembered that wasn't home anymore either. Sloan would be collecting her things, probably with movers and attorneys to make sure Grant didn't contest any of it. He couldn't go back there. Not yet. "The Riverside Hotel," Grant said. "I need a room." The Riverside was a mid-tier business hotel, the kind of place where salespeople stayed during conferences and divorced men landed when they couldn't face their empty apartments. It was anonymous and depressing, which fit Grant's mood perfectly. He checked in using a credit card that hopefully wasn't maxed out yet, and carried his box of office remnants to a room that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and defeat. The view was of the parking garage. The bed was queen-sized and looked like it had absorbed the sadness of 1,000 failed business trips. Grant set the box on the desk and pulled out his laptop. He needed to understand the full scope of the damage, needed to map out what came next. But when he opened his email, the scope became terrifyingly clear. 3 clients had sent termination notices overnight, citing concerns about recent developments and the need to reevaluate our partnership. 2 more had requested emergency meetings to discuss the path forward, which was code for giving Grant one chance to convince them not to leave. His phone rang. A headhunter he'd worked with years ago, probably calling to see if Grant needed help finding his next role. Or maybe just calling to confirm that the rumors were true, to update her database with his diminished status. Grant didn't answer. He couldn't face the conversation, couldn't stomach the carefully sympathetic tone she'd use while mentally calculating how much his reputation was worth now. Another email arrived, this one from Marcus Chen. Grant, I'm running the story tomorrow. Final chance for comment. The narrative without your voice is going to be brutal. M. Grant opened a reply window and stared at the cursor blinking in the empty white space. What could he possibly say? That he'd made mistakes? Everyone already knew that. That he was sorry? No one would believe him. That Claire had gone too far? She'd done exactly what he would have done in her position, identified a weakness and exploited it without mercy. He closed the email without responding. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from a number he recognized. His father, calling from the retirement community in Arizona where he'd moved after Grant's mother died. Grant almost didn't answer. His father had never approved of his career, had always thought Grant was too focused on money and status, had actively disliked Sloan on the one occasion they'd met. But the phone kept ringing, and finally Grant picked up. Dad? I saw the news, his father said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Thought I'd check in. I'm fine. You're not fine, but that's okay. Nobody's fine when their life falls apart. Grant felt something crack in his chest. His father had never been effusive, had never been the type to offer easy comfort, but he'd always been honest, which was more than Grant could say for himself lately. I made a lot of mistakes, Grant said quietly. I know. I could have told you this was coming if you'd ever asked. You didn't like Claire either, as I recall. I liked her fine, his father said. I didn't like the way you treated her, and I really didn't like watching you throw away a good woman for one who looked better in the society pages. The words hurt because they were true. Grant's father had always seen through the performance, had always known the difference between substance and shine. She destroyed me, Dad. Systematically. Patiently. She spent 2 years building a trap, and I walked right into it. Good for her, his father said, and Grant almost laughed at the bluntness of it. You taught her to be ruthless, and then you were surprised when she used those lessons. That's not tragedy, son. That's karma. Grant closed his eyes. I don't know what to do now. You figure out who you want to be when you're not winning. That's when character actually matters, when there's nothing left to hide behind. His father paused. You've got a choice to make, Grant. You can spend the next few years fighting this, trying to claw back what you lost, making yourself more bitter with every failure. Or you can accept that you lost, learn from it, and figure out how to be a better man than you were. That's not very practical advice. No, but it's true advice. And you're going to need some truth in your life because you've been drowning in comfortable lies for a long time. They talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, the weather in Arizona, the retirement community's golf course, whether Grant's father should get a dog, normal things, grounding things, the kind of conversation that reminded Grant there was a world beyond his own disaster. After they hung up, Grant sat in the hotel room and let himself feel the full weight of everything he'd lost. The career, the marriage, the reputation, the identity he'd built so carefully over so many years. All of it was gone. Stripped away by a woman he'd underestimated, using skills he'd helped her develop, exploiting weaknesses he'd been too arrogant to protect. And the worst part was knowing that he'd earned every bit of it, that Claire hadn't been cruel or excessive or unfair. She'd just been thorough. She'd just been better. Grant pulled out the photo of himself and Claire from the box on the desk, looked at the man he'd been, the woman she'd been, the partnership they'd built before he'd destroyed it. That man in the photo wouldn't recognize what Grant had become, would be ashamed of the choices, the callousness, the willingness to hurt someone who'd trusted him. For the first time in years, Grant felt the weight of genuine shame settle over him like a heavy coat. Not embarrassment at being caught, not frustration at losing, but actual shame at the person he'd allowed himself to become. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from Claire. The audit begins Monday morning. I'm required to notify you that you'll need to provide testimony under oath regarding all Meridian-related transactions you facilitated. Your cooperation is mandatory and will be a matter of public record. I'm sorry it's come to this, but not sorry enough to stop. Grant read the message 3 times, parsing every word for hidden meaning, for any hint of the woman he'd once known. But there was nothing personal there, nothing emotional, just facts and requirements, delivered with the same professional courtesy she'd have shown any witness in a legal proceeding. He'd become a witness to his own downfall, a supporting character in Claire's story of triumph, and there was something almost peaceful in that realization. He didn't have to fight anymore, didn't have to strategize or calculate or pretend. He'd already lost. The only question now was how he would handle the losing. Grant typed a response. "I'll cooperate fully. You have my word." Claire's reply came back almost immediately. "Your word doesn't mean much anymore, but I'll take your cooperation." It was the truth, delivered without malice. Grant's word had become worthless because he'd spent years proving that his promises meant nothing when they conflicted with his ambitions. He set his phone down and looked around the depressing hotel room that represented his new reality. No penthouse views, no corner office, no beautiful wife or impressive title or any of the external markers of success he'd spent his life chasing. Just Grant Harlow, alone with the consequences of his choices, finally forced to confront the man he'd become. His father was right. This was the moment that mattered. Not the winning, but what came after the losing. Not the climb up, but the crawl back from the bottom. Grant didn't know yet who he wanted to be, but for the first time in a very long time, he was willing to find out. The knock on the hotel room door came at 7 on Monday morning, sharp and authoritative. Grant had been awake since 5, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion that had settled into his bones like sediment. He opened the door to find a woman in a crisp navy suit holding a leather briefcase flanked by a man who was clearly private security. "Mr. Harlow, I'm Jessica Brennan, lead counsel for the Meridian Capital Transition Team. We're here to escort you to the deposition." Grant had known this was coming. Claire's text had been clear, but the reality of it still felt surreal. He grabbed his jacket and followed them to a black sedan waiting in the hotel parking lot. The drive to Meridian's headquarters took 20 minutes through morning traffic, and Jessica spent the time reviewing the ground rules. "You'll be questioned under oath about every transaction you facilitated between your firm and Meridian Capital over the past 3 years. Mrs. Hanley will be present but will not participate directly in the questioning. That will be handled by external counsel to avoid any appearance of personal bias." Grant almost laughed at that. Personal bias was the foundation of this entire situation. But Jessica's expression made it clear that humor wasn't welcome, so he kept quiet. The Meridian building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district. Grant had been here dozens of times for meetings and negotiations, always as a welcomed guest, a valued partner. Now he was being escorted through a side entrance like a suspect. They took him to a conference room on the 40th floor, all polished wood and leather chairs and windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. A court reporter sat in the corner, her stenography machine at the ready. 3 attorneys were arranged along one side of the table, their expressions professionally neutral, but their eyes sharp with predatory focus. And at the head of the table, reviewing documents with calm concentration, sat Claire. She looked up as Grant entered, and their eyes met for the first time since the gala. She wore a charcoal suit that looked expensive but understated, her hair pulled back in a style that was all business. There were faint circles under her eyes that suggested she'd been working as hard as Grant had been worrying. "Mr. Harlow," she said, her voice professionally courteous, "thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Grant sat across from the attorneys, acutely aware of how the power dynamic had shifted. He was the one being questioned now, the one whose every word would be scrutinized and cataloged and potentially used against him. The lead attorney, a woman named Catherine Reynolds, who had a reputation for making executives cry during depositions, opened a thick binder and smiled at Grant with the warmth of a shark. "Let's begin with the Harrington Medical Systems transaction from August 2 years ago. Can you describe your role in facilitating that deal?" For the next 4 hours, Grant answered questions with painful precision. Every meeting he'd arranged using Sloan's family connections. Every fee structure he'd negotiated that benefited him personally while increasing the firm's risk exposure. Every conversation he'd had with Meridian executives that should have been disclosed but wasn't. Catherine was relentless, finding inconsistencies in his testimony and pressing until Grant had to admit things he'd spent years rationalizing away. that he'd used insider knowledge from Sloan about Meridian's investment priorities, that he'd structured deals to maximize his own compensation at the expense of his firm's junior partners, that he'd knowingly created conflicts of interest because he'd believed his relationships made him untouchable. Claire never asked a single question. She just sat there, taking notes occasionally, her expression giving nothing away. But Grant could feel her presence like a weight, could sense her cataloging every admission, every revealed weakness. Around noon, Catherine called for a lunch break. The attorneys filed out, leaving Grant alone in the conference room. He stood and walked to the windows, looking down at the city where he'd once felt like a king. The door opened behind him. He turned, expecting Jessica to tell him lunch had arrived, but instead found Claire standing there alone. "We should talk," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. Grant's heart rate spiked. This was the first time they'd been alone together since the divorce. The first time there was no audience, no performance required. "About what?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. Claire moved to the window beside him, maintaining a careful distance, looking out at the same view. "About what happens next. The audit is uncovering worse things than I expected, Grant. Not just conflicts of interest, but actual fraud. Meridian's previous leadership was cooking the books, inflating valuations, hiding losses in shell companies. And some of those shell companies were entities you helped create." Grant felt the floor drop out from under him. "I didn't know about any fraud. I would never—" "I know," Claire interrupted, and her voice held a note of something that might have been sympathy. "I've been through your communications, your files, every document with your name on it. You were arrogant and unethical, but you weren't part of the actual criminal activity. You were just useful to them. A way to legitimize questionable deals through your relationship with the Mercer family. That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No, but it means you have a choice." She finally looked at him, and Grant saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected, not triumph or satisfaction, but exhaustion. "I'm going to expose everything I've found. The fraud, the corruption, the systematic looting of Meridian's assets by the previous executive team. It's going to be a massive scandal, and it's going to destroy a lot of careers, including mine." "Your career is already destroyed," Claire said bluntly. "What I'm offering you is a chance to rebuild it on something other than deception." Grant stared at her. "What do you mean?" "I need witnesses. People who can testify about how the old regime operated, who can provide context for the transactions that look legitimate on paper but were actually part of a larger scheme. You were close to those executives. You saw things, even if you didn't understand what you were seeing at the time. You want me to turn on the people I did business with?" "I want you to tell the truth." Claire's voice was steady, implacable. "I know that's a novel concept for you, but it's remarkably simple. Answer questions honestly. Provide documentation. Help me build a case that will hold up in court. And in exchange, I recommend immunity for you. The prosecutors will want cooperation from someone inside the network, and you're well positioned to provide it. You won't face criminal charges, and you won't be named as a defendant in the civil suits that are coming." Grant turned the offer over in his mind, looking for the trap. What's to stop me from lying? From protecting the people who could still help me rebuild? Claire's laugh was bitter. "Those people are gone, Grant. By this time next week, half of Meridian's executive team will be arrested. The other half will be fleeing the country or cutting their own immunity deals. No one is coming to save you. No one even remembers you exist except as evidence in a fraud case." The words were brutal, but Grant recognized the truth in them. He'd burned through his social capital, alienated his allies, made himself disposable in his rush to climb higher. "Why are you offering me this?" he asked. "You could just let me burn with the rest of them. Because despite everything, I don't think you're actually evil, just weak. And I've learned that weak people can still choose to do the right thing when there's no other option left." She paused. "Also, because having your cooperation will make the case stronger. And I want these people buried. They didn't just steal money. They destroyed retirement accounts, pension funds, the savings of people who trusted them. They deserve everything that's coming to them." Grant heard the steel in her voice and recognized something fundamental. This wasn't about him anymore, if it ever had been. Claire was building something bigger than revenge, something that mattered beyond their personal history. "I'll cooperate," he said. "Completely. Whatever you need." Claire nodded slowly, studying his face like she was trying to determine if he meant it. "Okay, I'll set up a meeting with the prosecutors for later this week. In the meantime, keep answering Catherine's questions honestly. Don't try to minimize what you did or make excuses. Just tell the truth. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it came to this. I didn't want to destroy you, Grant. I just wanted to stop you from destroying anyone else. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving Grant alone with the weight of what she'd said. The afternoon session was worse than the morning. Catherine had clearly received new information during lunch, and her questions became more pointed, more aggressive. She walked Grant through a series of transactions that looked increasingly suspicious when examined together, a pattern of deals that had enriched Meridian executives while exposing the fund's investors to unreported risk. Grant answered as honestly as he could, watching the attorneys exchange glances that told him he was giving them exactly what they needed. By the time Catherine called an end to the deposition at 6 p.m., Grant felt hollowed out, scraped clean of every rationalization he'd used to justify his behavior. Jessica drove him back to the hotel in silence. As he climbed out of the car, she handed him a business card. The prosecutor handling the Meridian case wants to meet with you Thursday morning. Be there, be honest, and maybe you'll get through this without a criminal record. Grant took the card and watched the sedan pull away, then turned to face the hotel that had become his temporary home. The depressing lobby, the sad elevator, the room that smelled like failure and cheap air freshener. He ordered takeout from a Thai restaurant and ate it without tasting anything, his mind replaying moments from the deposition. The way Claire had looked at him in the conference room, offering him redemption while making it clear she didn't trust him to take it. The exhaustion in her eyes that came from carrying the weight of other people's greed and corruption. She'd changed in ways that went beyond the surface confidence and professional success. She'd developed a moral clarity that Grant had never possessed, a commitment to something larger than personal victory. It made him realize how small his own ambitions had been, how he'd spent years chasing status and wealth without ever asking himself what those things were for, what he wanted to build with them, who he wanted to be once he had them. His phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. Grant almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Grant Harlow? Yes? This is Thomas Weinstein. I'm an attorney representing several former Meridian executives. I understand you were deposed today regarding your business relationship with the company. Grant's guard went up immediately. I can't discuss the deposition. I'm not asking you to. I'm calling to offer you legal representation and to advise you that speaking with the transition team or prosecutors without counsel present is a mistake you'll regret. I already have a lawyer. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're cooperating with people who want to use you as a scapegoat for crimes you didn't commit. Weinstein's voice was smooth, persuasive. My clients are prepared to provide you with top-tier legal representation in exchange for your testimony supporting their defense. We can protect you, Grant. Make sure you don't take the fall for other people's decisions. Grant recognized the offer for what it was, an attempt to flip him, to turn him against Claire's investigation in exchange for protection he didn't actually need. Who are your clients? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. I represent the interests of several Meridian executives who believe they're being targeted unfairly by the new leadership. People who could help you rebuild your career once this witch hunt is over. There it was. The old network, the old relationships, trying to reassert themselves, offering Grant a lifeline back to the world he'd lost, if he was willing to undermine Claire's investigation. 6 months ago, Grant would have taken the offer without hesitation, would have seen it as smart strategy, good business, the way survival worked at the top. But 6 months ago, Grant hadn't spent 4 hours answering questions that forced him to confront every corner he'd cut, every ethical line he'd crossed, every person he'd used on his way up. Mr. Weinstein, I appreciate the call, but I'm not interested in your representation. Grant, be reasonable. These people can help you. These people are criminals, Grant said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. And I'm done helping criminals pretend to be legitimate business people. Don't call me again. He hung up before Weinstein could respond, his heart pounding. It felt strange turning down an offer of help from people who still had power. But it also felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in a very long time. Grant pulled out his laptop and started writing. Not a legal document or business proposal, but something more personal. a letter to Claire that he'd probably never send but needed to write anyway. He wrote about the early days when they'd been partners in every sense, about the moment he'd decided she wasn't enough, wasn't the right kind of asset for the life he wanted to build, about the divorce and the deliberate cruelty of it, the way he'd used the legal system to break her because he could. He wrote about watching her at the gala, realizing she'd become everything he'd always needed but had been too blind to value, about the shame of being destroyed by someone he'd underestimated, using skills he'd helped her develop. And he wrote about the choice she'd given him that afternoon, to cooperate with the investigation, to tell the truth, to maybe find some redemption in the ashes of his ruined career. The letter ran to 6 pages before Grant finally stopped, his fingers tired and his eyes burning. He read through it once, cringing at the raw emotion, the naked admission of everything he'd done wrong. Then he saved it in a folder labeled unsent and closed his laptop. The rest of the week passed in a blur of meetings with prosecutors, more depositions, and long hours spent reviewing documents to identify which transactions had been legitimate and which had been part of the fraud scheme. Grant cooperated fully, answering every question, providing every piece of evidence he had access to. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Chen, seemed initially skeptical of Grant's willingness to help. But as the days progressed and Grant continued to provide detailed, honest testimony that incriminated people who might have helped him rebuild his career, her skepticism shifted to something like grudging respect. "You understand that your cooperation doesn't erase what you did," she said during one break. "The conflicts of interest, the self-dealing, that's still wrong, even if it wasn't technically criminal." "I know," Grant replied. "I'm not asking for absolution. I'm just trying to make sure the actual criminals don't get away with it." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "Claire Hanley speaks highly of your analytical abilities. Says you're brilliant when you're not letting your ego get in the way." Grant felt something twist in his chest. "She said that?" "She did. Also said you were the worst mistake she ever made, but that your talent for identifying patterns in financial data is world-class." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "She thinks you could still contribute something valuable to the world if you ever figure out how to use your abilities for something other than self-advancement." "Did she ask you to tell me that?" "No, but I thought you should know that she hasn't completely written you off. Even after everything you did to her, she still sees potential in you." Sarah paused. "Don't waste it." On Friday evening, Grant sat in his hotel room and watched the news coverage of the arrests. 7 former Meridian executives were taken into custody in coordinated raids across the city. The charges included fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and money laundering. The news anchors used words like massive and unprecedented and shocking. Grant's name wasn't mentioned, which meant Sarah had kept her promise. He'd been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, and his role would be limited to witness testimony in the eventual trials. His phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Thank you for your cooperation this week. The case is stronger because of your testimony." Grant stared at the message, trying to find hidden meaning, emotional subtext, anything beyond the professional courtesy. But there was nothing there except acknowledgement of a job done. He typed back, "It was the right thing to do. I should have done a lot of things differently. I'm sorry." This time, Claire's response took several minutes. When it came, it was longer than her usual terse messages. "I spent 2 years being angry at you, planning this, building Oracle, working toward the moment when I could make you understand what you'd done to me. But now that it's happened, all I feel is tired, and sad for the people we could have been if you'd chosen differently. I hope you figure out who you want to be, Grant, because the person you were isn't worth the energy I spent destroying him." Grant read the message 3 times, feeling the finality in every word. This was Claire's goodbye, her release of whatever anger had fueled her through the takeover and the investigation. She was done with him, done with their shared history, done with the narrative that had defined both of their lives for the past 2 years. And Grant realized he needed to be done with it too, needed to stop defining himself in opposition to Claire's success or in terms of what he'd lost. Needed to figure out who Grant Harlow could be when he wasn't performing for an audience or climbing toward the next victory. On Saturday morning, Grant moved out of the hotel and into a modest apartment in the Riverside district, the same neighborhood where Claire had worked during those missing 3 years between the divorce and her reemergence. The apartment was small, just a bedroom, bathroom, and combined living area, but it was clean and quiet and affordable on the dwindling remains of his savings. His father called that afternoon to check in, and Grant found himself actually talking instead of just performing the role of dutiful son. He told his father about the cooperation with prosecutors, about the immunity deal, about his uncertain future. "Sounds like you're finally learning the lesson I tried to teach you when you were 10, his father said. "What lesson was that?" "That character is what you do when nobody's watching and there's nothing in it for you. You spent your whole career optimizing for an audience. Maybe it's time to figure out who you are when there's no one left to impress." Grant thought about that after they hung up. For the first time in his adult life, he had no job to define him, no wife to perform for, no social circle to maintain. Just himself and the question of what he was going to build with whatever pieces remained. He spent the weekend cleaning the apartment, buying basic furniture from a discount store, setting up a space that felt like it belonged to someone starting over, rather than someone spiraling down. It was humbling work, assembling flat-pack furniture and scrubbing floors, but there was something peaceful about the simplicity of it. On Sunday evening, Grant's phone rang with a call from David at the firm. Grant answered cautiously, unsure what his former partner could possibly want. "I saw the news about the arrests," David said without preamble. "You cooperated with the investigation." "I did. The board wants to know if you'd be willing to testify about the Meridian transactions if there are civil suits against the firm. We're likely to face claims that we should have caught the fraud earlier." Grant understood what David was really asking, whether Grant would protect the firm by taking sole responsibility, or whether he'd tell the truth about the institutional failures that had allowed the fraud to continue. "I'll testify honestly about what happened," Grant said, "about what I knew, when I knew it, and what warnings I ignored. I won't lie to protect the firm, but I won't exaggerate the firm's culpability either, just the facts." David was quiet for a moment. "That's fair. More than fair, actually. Thank you." "David, I'm sorry for everything I put you and the team through. I know, and for what it's worth, I think you're finally becoming the person you always could have been if you hadn't been so obsessed with winning." David paused. "There might be some consulting work coming up. Nothing big, just small firms that need help with financial modeling and due diligence. I could send some clients your way if you're interested." It was an olive branch, a hint that maybe Grant's professional reputation wasn't completely destroyed, that maybe there was a path back to doing work that mattered, even if it would never be at the level he'd once achieved. "I'd appreciate that," Grant said quietly. After they hung up, Grant stood at his apartment window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Claire was probably working late in her new office at Meridian, building the kind of company she'd always wanted to work for. Ethical, transparent, focused on creating value rather than extracting it. She'd won completely. Not just the takeover, not just the exposure of corruption, but the larger battle for who would define the narrative of their shared history. And Grant had lost completely. His career, his marriage, his reputation, his identity as a winner. But standing there in his modest apartment, with no audience and nothing to prove, Grant felt something unexpected. Relief. He was tired of performing, tired of calculating every interaction for strategic advantage, tired of being the person who valued winning above everything else. Maybe losing was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Maybe it was the only thing that could have forced him to confront who he'd become and decide whether that was who he wanted to stay. Grant pulled out his laptop and opened a new document. Not a letter this time, but a list. A real, honest accounting of his skills, his experience, and the kind of work he could do that might actually help people instead of just enriching himself. Financial modeling, due diligence, pattern recognition in complex data sets. The ability to explain complicated concepts in ways that non-experts could understand. He'd spent years using those skills to benefit himself and his clients, without much regard for whether the work itself was good or valuable. What if he started using them differently? What if he built a practice around helping small businesses understand their finances, or teaching people about financial literacy, or working with nonprofits that needed sophisticated analysis but couldn't afford big consulting firms? It wouldn't make him rich. It wouldn't get his name back on anyone's door or earn him invitations to charity galas. But it might let him look at himself in the mirror without shame. Grant started making notes, sketching out what a practice like that might look like. The kind of clients he could serve, the fees he could charge that would be sustainable but not exploitative, The partnerships he could build with organizations that shared his newfound interest in doing work that mattered. It was tentative, uncertain, nothing like the bold strategies he used to craft. But it was honest, and after years of building his life on performance and deception, honesty felt like solid ground. His phone buzzed one last time that night, a message from a number he didn't recognize with just a link and a short note. "Thought you might be interested." "Who?" Grant clicked the link and found himself looking at a job posting. Equor Ventures, the name Claire had chosen for the renamed Meridian Capital, was looking for a director of financial education and literacy programs, someone with deep expertise in financial modeling who could translate that knowledge into curricula for underserved communities and small business owners. The position reported directly to the CEO, to Claire. Grant stared at the posting, his mind racing. Was this an olive branch? A test? An acknowledgement that despite everything, she still saw value in what he could contribute? Or was it just Claire being pragmatic, recognizing that Grant's skills were well suited to a role that needed filling, and that his current desperation made him unlikely to negotiate aggressively on salary? He read through the job description 3 times, looking for hidden meaning. The salary was modest, less than a quarter of what he'd been making at his peak. The work was decidedly unglamorous. Teaching, curriculum development, community outreach. Nothing that would rebuild his reputation or restore his status. But it was real work. Important work. The kind of work that might let him use his abilities to help people who actually needed help instead of making rich people richer. Grant opened a reply to Claire's message and typed, "Is this a serious offer or are you just twisting the knife?" Her response came back within minutes. "It's a serious offer. You're good at what you do when you're not being self-serving. This role would force you to be useful to people who can't do anything for your career. I think that might be good for you. But the decision is yours." Grant sat with that for a long time, weighing the implications. Taking this job would mean working for Claire, reporting to the woman he'd betrayed, accepting a salary that would barely cover the rent on his modest apartment. It would mean admitting, publicly and definitively, that he'd fallen from grace and wasn't coming back. But it would also mean doing work that mattered. Learning from someone who understood how to build something valuable instead of just extracting value from other people's work. Maybe even finding a way to contribute something meaningful to the world. He typed his response slowly, carefully, knowing that this decision would define everything that came after. "I'm interested. When can we talk about it?" Claire's reply was almost instant. "Monday morning, 9 a.m. My office. Don't be late." Grant set his phone down and looked around his small apartment, at the discount furniture and bare walls, at the life he was building from scratch with no shortcuts and no pretense. For the first time in years, he felt something that might have been hope. Not hope for redemption or restoration or a return to what he'd lost, but hope that maybe, just maybe, he could become someone worth being, someone who used his talents to help instead of harm, someone who valued truth over victory. Someone Claire Hanley might eventually respect, even if she never forgave him. It was a small hope, fragile and uncertain. But it was real. And after everything that had happened, real was enough. Grant arrived at the Equor Ventures building 15 minutes early on Monday morning, his resume printed on good paper that he'd bought specifically for this interview. The building was the same one that had housed Meridian Capital, but everything else had changed. The lobby had been redesigned with clean lines and natural light, the corporate portraiture replaced with photographs of community programs and small businesses. Even the security desk felt different, professional but welcoming rather than imposing. The receptionist checked his name against her list and smiled. "Ms. Hanley is expecting you, 40th floor, conference room B." Grant took the elevator up, his heart pounding harder with each ascending floor. He'd spent the weekend preparing for this meeting, rehearsing answers to questions he thought Claire might ask, trying to anticipate how she'd test whether he'd actually changed or was just performing contrition. Conference room B was smaller than the one where he'd been deposed, with windows that looked east over the city. Claire was already there, reviewing something on her tablet, wearing a gray suit that managed to look both professional and approachable. She looked up as Grant entered, and her expression was carefully neutral. "Grant, thank you for being on time." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, sit." Grant sat, acutely aware of how the power dynamic had shifted. He was the supplicant now, the one asking for opportunity rather than bestowing it. I've reviewed your qualifications, Claire said, setting her tablet aside. On paper, you're overqualified for this position. You have an MBA from Wharton, 15 years of experience in complex financial analysis, and a track record of building sophisticated models that even I have to admit are impressive. But, Grant prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation. But this role isn't about being impressive. It's about being useful to people who don't have MBAs or 15 years of experience. It's about taking complex concepts and making them accessible to small business owners who are trying to understand their cash flow or community members who are trying to build financial literacy. She leaned forward slightly. It's about service, not status. Can you do that? Grant met her eyes. I don't know, but I want to try. Why? The question was direct, almost challenging. You could rebuild your consulting practice, work with mid-tier firms that would pay you 3 times what this position offers. Why would you want to work here? Reporting to me, doing work that won't restore your reputation or get you back into the circles you used to run in. Grant had anticipated this question, but sitting across from Claire, seeing the skepticism in her eyes, he realized that any prepared answer would sound hollow. She deserved the truth, raw and unpolished. Because I spent 15 years building a career on extracting value from other people's work and calling it success. I optimized for money and status without ever asking whether what I was doing actually mattered. And when I finally achieved everything I thought I wanted, I realized I'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone I didn't particularly like. He paused, gathering his thoughts. You didn't just take away my career, Claire. You forced me to see what I'd become. And what I saw was someone who'd spent years using people, including you, especially you, as stepping stones to something that turned out to be empty. Claire's expression didn't change, but Grant thought he saw something flicker in her eyes. Not forgiveness, but perhaps attention. This role wouldn't fix what I did, Grant continued. Nothing can fix that. But it might let me use the skills I developed, the ones you helped me refine when we were partners, to actually help people instead of exploiting them. And maybe, over time, I could become someone who contributes something meaningful instead of just taking. The silence stretched between them, heavy with history and hurt and the weight of everything they'd once been to each other. Finally, Claire spoke. I'm not offering you redemption. I want to be very clear about that. This is a job, nothing more. You'd be an employee, not a partner. You'd report to someone 10 years younger than you who will expect you to teach financial literacy to teenagers in underserved neighborhoods without any promise of recognition or advancement. I understand. And if you revert to your old patterns, if you start treating people as assets to be leveraged, if you prioritize your ego over the mission, if you demonstrate any of the behavior that characterized your previous career, I will fire you immediately. No second chances, no opportunities to explain. Just termination. I understand that too. Claire studied him for a long moment, and Grant forced himself to hold her gaze without flinching, without performing confidence he didn't feel. Just being present, being honest, being willing to accept whatever judgment she rendered. The salary is $65,000, Claire said finally. No bonuses, no equity, no promises of future advancement. You'd start as soon as the background check clears, which, given your recent cooperation with prosecutors, should be straightforward. Grant felt something loosen in his chest. Are you offering me the job? I'm offering you an opportunity to prove that people can change. Whether you actually do the work of changing is up to you. She pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. This is the employment agreement. Read it carefully. If you decide to accept, sign it and return it by end of day Wednesday. Grant opened the folder, scanning the terms. Everything Claire had said was there in black and white. The modest salary, the reporting structure, the termination clause that gave her absolute discretion to fire him for cause. It was the least secure, least prestigious position he'd held since graduating from business school. I'll sign it today, Grant said. Take the time to read it properly. This isn't a decision to make impulsively. I don't need time. This is exactly what I need, even if it's not what I would have wanted 6 months ago. Grant looked up from the document. Thank you, Claire, for seeing potential in me that I'm not sure I've earned. Something shifted in Claire's expression, a subtle softening that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. I'm not doing this for you, Grant. I'm doing it because this organization needs someone with your analytical skills, and hiring you is more efficient than training someone from scratch." She stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "But I meant what I said. This is your chance to prove people can change. Don't waste it." Grant stood as well, extending his hand. Claire looked at it for a moment before shaking it, her grip firm and professional. The touch lasted only seconds, but Grant felt the weight of everything unspoken between them, the partnership they'd once shared, the betrayal that had destroyed it, the possibility of something new being built on the ruins. "I'll see you next Monday," Claire said, releasing his hand and turning back to her tablet. "HR will send you the onboarding information." Grant left the conference room feeling lighter than he had in months, despite having just accepted a job that represented everything his old self would have considered failure. As he rode the elevator down, he thought about what his father had said. That character was what you did when nobody was watching, and there's nothing in it for you. This was his chance to find out what his character actually was, stripped of status and performance and the constant need to win. The next weeks passed in a blur of orientation and training. Grant met his new supervisor, a 32-year-old woman named Jenna Rodriguez, who had a master's in education and exactly zero patience for corporate nonsense. She made it clear from their first meeting that she didn't care about Grant's previous experience or his connection to Claire. "What I care about," Jenna said bluntly, "is whether you can explain a cash flow statement to a single mother who's trying to start a catering business out of her apartment. Everything else is noise." Grant threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised him. He developed curricula for financial literacy workshops, simplified complex concepts into language that didn't require a business degree to understand, and spent hours in community centers teaching people who'd never had access to the kind of knowledge he'd taken for granted. It was humbling work. Teenagers in the programs would challenge his explanations, forcing him to find simpler ways to explain compound interest or risk assessment. Small business owners would ask questions he'd never considered because he'd always worked with clients who already understood the fundamentals. Grant found himself learning as much as he was teaching, seeing the financial world through the eyes of people for whom a few $100s could mean the difference between stability and crisis. It gave him perspective he'd never had during his years of optimizing deals worth millions. He rarely saw Claire during those first months. Ecor Ventures was large enough that their paths didn't cross naturally, and Grant suspected she was deliberately maintaining distance. But occasionally he'd glimpse her in the hallway or see her name on an email chain, and each time he felt a complicated mix of gratitude and regret. Gratitude for the opportunity she'd given him, regret for everything he'd destroyed that could never be rebuilt. 6 months into his new role, Grant received an unexpected email from Jenna. "Claire wants to observe your workshop tomorrow. Don't change anything about how you run it. She's evaluating the program, not you specifically." Grant spent that evening reviewing his lesson plan with unusual anxiety. Tomorrow's workshop was focused on helping small business owners understand their tax obligations, and he developed what he thought was an effective framework for breaking down complicated regulations into actionable steps. But having Claire in the room would add a layer of scrutiny that made him question every choice he'd made. The workshop was held in a community center in the Parkside neighborhood, the same area where Grant had operated his first office 15 years ago. 23 small business owners showed up, ranging from a young woman who'd just opened a hair salon to an older man who'd been running a family restaurant for 30 years but had never fully understood the tax code. Claire arrived 5 minutes before the start time, taking a seat in the back row without greeting Grant. She had a notepad and appeared ready to take notes with the same intensity she'd once brought to analyzing complex financial structures. Grant began the workshop the way he always did, asking participants to share their biggest concerns about taxes. The answers came quickly: fear of audits, confusion about deductions, uncertainty about quarterly payments. Grant wrote each concern on the whiteboard, then started breaking them down one by one. He'd learned over the past months that the best teaching came from meeting people where they were, using their actual businesses as examples rather than abstract scenarios. So when Maria, the hair salon owner, expressed confusion about what expenses she could deduct, Grant walked through her specific situation: the chair rentals, the products, the portion of her phone bill she used for business. He noticed Claire taking notes, but forced himself not to perform for her, to stay focused on the people he was actually there to serve. 2 hours later, the workshop ended with several participants staying after to ask individual questions. Grant worked through each one patiently, aware that Claire was still in the back row, still observing, still evaluating. Finally, the last participant left, and Grant began packing up his materials. Claire approached, her expression unreadable. "That was good work," she said simply. Grant felt a rush of relief he tried not to show. "Thank you." Maria, the salon owner, she's been trying to understand her tax obligations for 2 years. According to Jenna's notes, you're the first person who's explained it in a way that actually made sense to her. She's smart and motivated. She just needed someone to translate the jargon. Claire tilted her head slightly, studying him. You're different when you teach, less performative, more focused on the other person's understanding than on demonstrating your own knowledge. I'm trying to be useful instead of impressive. It shows. Claire glanced at her notes. I'm expanding the financial literacy program. We're getting requests from community organizations across the city, more than Jenna's team can handle. I need someone to manage the expansion, develop a training program for additional instructors, and maintain quality control as we scale. Grant's pulse quickened. You're offering me a promotion? I'm offering you more responsibility. The salary increase would be modest. This organization doesn't operate on the bonus structures you're used to, but it would give you an opportunity to amplify your impact. She paused, and something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. You've done good work these past 6 months, Grant. Consistent, humble, focused on service. I wanted you to know that it's been noticed. The words meant more to Grant than any praise he'd received during his previous career. This wasn't empty flattery or political maneuvering. It was Claire acknowledging that he'd actually changed, that the transformation was real and sustained. I'd be honored to take on the expanded role, Grant said quietly. Good. We'll formalize it next week. Claire turned to leave, then paused. There's something else. The Meridian fraud trials are starting next month. The prosecutors will need you to testify about the transactions you facilitated. It's going to be public, and it's going to be uncomfortable. The defense attorneys will try to make you look like a co-conspirator who's only cooperating to save himself. Grant nodded slowly. I expected that. I want you to know that whatever happens during the trial, your position here is secure as long as you continue doing the work. Your past doesn't define your future unless you let it. The statement hung between them, loaded with meaning that went beyond employment reassurance. Claire was telling him something important, that she'd truly let go of the anger that had fueled her takedown, that she saw him as someone capable of redemption rather than just a useful employee. Claire, Grant said before he could second-guess himself, I never properly apologized. Not for the divorce, not for the way I treated you during it, not for convincing myself that destroying you was just business strategy. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but you deserve to hear it. Claire was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions too quickly for Grant to identify. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard it in years. I spent a long time being angry at you, building Oracle, planning the takeover, imagining the moment when you'd finally understand what you'd done to me. But anger is exhausting, and eventually I realized I didn't want to carry it anymore. She met his eyes directly. I forgave you, Grant, not because you deserved it, but because I deserved peace. The words hit Grant harder than any punishment could have. Forgiveness without conditions, offered not for his benefit, but for hers. It was the most profound form of closure he could have imagined. Thank you, he managed. Claire nodded once, then left the community center, leaving Grant alone with his materials and the weight of everything that had passed between them. The fraud trials began in November, and Grant spent 3 days on the witness stand describing his role in facilitating transactions that had masked systematic looting of Meridian's assets. The defense attorneys were brutal, trying to paint him as an active participant who was now trying to shift blame. But Grant stuck to the truth, acknowledging his conflicts of interest, his ethical failures, his willingness to benefit from relationships without questioning the underlying legitimacy. He didn't minimize what he'd done, but he also didn't exaggerate it to serve the prosecution's narrative. The media coverage was extensive, and Grant's name appeared in headlines that ranged from former dealmaker testifies against Meridian executives to Grant Harlow, from power player to prosecution witness. His face was on the evening news, his past dissected by commentators who debated whether his cooperation represented genuine transformation or strategic self-preservation. Through it all, Claire never commented publicly. Equor Ventures released a brief statement confirming Grant's employment and expressing confidence in the judicial process, but Claire herself maintained complete silence about her ex-husband's very public testimony. Grant appreciated the discretion more than he could express. She could have used his testimony to reinforce her own narrative, to publicly claim vindication for the takedown. But she didn't. She let the legal process unfold without inserting herself into the story, demonstrating a restraint that Grant had never possessed during his own years of success. The trials ended in December with guilty verdicts for all 7 defendants. The sentences ranged from 8 to 20 years, and the prosecutors thanked Grant publicly for his cooperation. Sarah Chen, the lead prosecutor, told reporters that Grant's testimony had been credible, detailed, and essential to securing convictions. Grant watched the coverage from his apartment, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it had come at a cost that included the destruction of his own career and reputation. He'd been necessary to the process, but he'd also been complicit in creating the conditions that had made the fraud possible. 2 days after the verdicts, Grant received an unexpected visitor at the Equor Ventures office. Sloane appeared in the lobby, looking thinner than Grant remembered, her usual polish dimmed but still present. The receptionist called up to Grant's extension, and he came down to meet his ex-wife with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Sloane, this is unexpected." "I know, She glanced around the lobby, clearly uncomfortable in these surroundings. Can we talk? Just for a few minutes." They found a coffee shop down the block and sat at a corner table, the awkwardness between them palpable. Sloane ordered an espresso she didn't drink, just held the cup like she needed something to do with her hands. "I saw your testimony," she said finally. "All 3 days of it. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I know some of it implicated your family's business dealings. Daddy's lawyers are handling it. We'll be fine. The Mercers always are." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I wanted to tell you that you were right about what you said in the penthouse the night of the gala, that Claire didn't make mistakes, that she'd spent years building a perfect trap." Grant waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. "I spent the past year trying to rebuild my reputation, trying to distance myself from the scandal. But everywhere I go, people ask about you, about Claire, about the takedown. And I realized something." Sloane met his eyes. "She didn't destroy you because she hated you. She destroyed you because she'd loved you, and you'd betrayed that love in the cruelest way possible. And somehow, that makes it worse." "Why does it make it worse?" "Because it means what we had was never real. I was just the next acquisition, the strategic upgrade. You never loved me. You loved what I represented." Her voice cracked slightly. "And I think I always knew that. But I told myself it didn't matter because we wanted the same things. Except we didn't really want anything except to look successful." Grant felt the truth of her words settle over him. "I'm sorry, Sloane. You deserved someone who actually saw you, not just the doors you could open." "We deserved each other," Sloane said with a bitter laugh. "Two people playing at a relationship while actually just networking. But you got something I didn't. You got forced to stop performing and figure out who you actually are. I'm still performing, still trying to maintain the image, still pretending that everything's fine when really I'm just..." She trailed off. "Lost?" Grant suggested gently. "Completely." Sloane finally took a sip of her espresso, grimacing at the temperature. "I hear you're teaching financial literacy to small business owners now. That must be quite the adjustment. It's the most meaningful work I've ever done. Do you actually believe that, or is it just another performance?" Grant considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I would have been performing, but somewhere along the way, it became real. I started caring about whether Maria understood her tax obligations more than I cared about whether anyone was impressed by my teaching methods. Sloane studied him with something that might have been envy. "I don't know how to do that. How to care about something that doesn't advance my position or improve my image." "Start small," Grant suggested. "Find one thing that matters to you independent of how it looks to other people. One thing you'd do even if no one ever knew about it." They talked for another half hour, the conversation meandering through shared memories and separate paths forward. When Sloane finally stood to leave, She looked at Grant with an expression he'd never seen from her before. Genuine vulnerability. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said. "Whatever that is. I hope the same for you." After Sloane left, Grant sat in the coffee shop for a while longer, thinking about the various versions of himself he'd performed over the years. The ambitious entrepreneur, the ruthless deal maker, the sophisticated power player. All of them had been real in a sense, but none of them had been complete. They'd been roles he'd adopted to achieve specific outcomes, masks he'd worn to project success. The person he was becoming now, the teacher, the servant, the man trying to use his abilities to help rather than exploit, felt more authentic than any previous version. Not because it was more noble, but because it required less performance. He could just be useful without needing to be impressive. His phone buzzed with a text from Jenna. "Next month's workshop schedule is ready for review. Also, Claire wants to see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. She didn't say why." Grant felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, but it was different now. Not the fear of being evaluated and found wanting, but simply curiosity about what Claire might need. The next morning, Grant arrived at Claire's office exactly on time. Her assistant waved him in, and he found Claire standing by her windows, looking out at the city with an expression that suggested she'd been thinking about something difficult. "Grant, thank you for coming." She gestured to the sitting area rather than the formal conference table. "This isn't about work, exactly. Or maybe it is. I'm not entirely sure." Grant sat, intrigued by this uncharacteristic uncertainty from someone who always seemed completely sure of herself. Claire sat across from him, and for a moment she just looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You've been here almost 8 months now. In that time, you've developed curricula that's being adopted by community organizations across the state. You've trained 17 new instructors who are replicating your teaching methods. You've helped over 300 small business owners understand their finances well enough to make better decisions. I've had excellent support from Jenna's team. Let me finish." Claire's voice was gentle but firm. "You've also testified in a major fraud trial, endured public scrutiny that would have broken most people, and maintained your commitment to this work despite having multiple opportunities to rebuild your consulting practice at a much higher salary." Grant waited, unsure where this was leading. "I'm creating a new position," Claire continued. "Director of Community Impact. It would oversee not just financial literacy, but all of Equer's community-focused programs, scholarship initiatives, small business incubation, economic development partnerships. It's a significant role with real budget authority and strategic influence." She paused, meeting his eyes. "I'm offering it to you, if you want it." Grant felt his heart rate spike. "Claire, I don't know what to say." "Say whether you're interested. This isn't charity or forgiveness or any kind of gesture related to our history. This is me recognizing that you've demonstrated the capabilities and commitment the role requires." "Why me? You could hire someone with a background in nonprofit management, someone without the baggage I bring." "I could," Claire agreed, "but they wouldn't have your ability to understand complex systems and translate them into accessible programs. They wouldn't have your credibility with the business community when we need corporate partnerships. And they wouldn't have your lived experience of what happens when you build success on unstable foundations." She leaned forward slightly. "You've become someone who understands both worlds, Grant. The world of high finance and the world of people who are locked out of it. That perspective is valuable, and I'd like to leverage it if you're willing." Grant thought about the offer, about what it would mean to take on a role with real authority again. Not the kind of authority he'd once craved, the power to close deals and accumulate wins, but something different. The authority to direct resources toward communities that needed them, to build programs that created opportunity rather than extracting value. "I'm interested," he said carefully, "but I want to be clear about something. If you're offering this because you think I've earned redemption or because our shared history creates some kind of obligation." "I'm not," Claire interrupted. "I'm offering this because Equer Ventures needs someone in this role, and you're the best candidate I've found. Our history is irrelevant to the business decision." The statement should have stung, that final confirmation that their shared past meant nothing to her anymore. But instead, Grant felt relief. This was clean, professional, based on merit rather than sentiment. "Then, yes, I'd be honored to take the role." Claire smiled, and it reached her eyes in a way Grant hadn't seen since before their marriage fell apart. "Good. We'll formalize it next week. The salary is significantly better than what you're making now, though still modest by your old standards. And Grant? She paused. This time, don't waste the opportunity by treating it as a stepping stone to something else. This is the work, not a path to something more prestigious, just the actual work of making things better for people who need it. I understand. Over the next year, Grant threw himself into building the Community Impact Division with the same intensity he'd once brought to deal-making, but channeled toward different ends. He developed partnerships with local businesses to create internship programs for young people in underserved neighborhoods. He designed a small business incubation program that provided not just capital, but education and mentorship. He created scholarship initiatives that gave students from low-income families access to financial literacy education. The work was challenging in ways Grant had never experienced. Success wasn't measured in closed deals or accumulated wealth, but in incremental changes that took months or years to materialize. A student who learned to budget and avoided predatory loans. A small business owner who understood her cash flow well enough to expand sustainably. A community that built economic resilience through better financial education. It was slow, unglamorous, and profoundly meaningful. Grant's relationship with Claire evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, a professional partnership built on mutual respect rather than romantic history. They met weekly to discuss community impact initiatives, and Grant found himself valuing her insights the way he once had in the early days of their marriage, but without the complicated emotional dynamics that had eventually poisoned their relationship. She was brilliant at identifying systemic issues that programs could address. He was good at translating those insights into practical curricula and partnerships. Together, they built something that neither could have created alone. Sometimes during their meetings, Grant would catch glimpses of the woman he'd once loved. The earnest brilliance, the commitment to doing work that mattered, the belief that intelligence should be used to solve problems rather than exploit them. But those glimpses were bittersweet, reminders of what he'd thrown away and what could never be recovered. 2 years after the gala that had destroyed his old life, Grant attended an event at the community center in Parkside. Acor Ventures was celebrating the graduation of 50 small business owners from the financial literacy program, and Grant had been asked to speak about the initiative's impact. He stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of people whose lives had been marginally improved by the work he'd helped build. Maria was there, her hair salon now profitable and expanding to a second location. Carlos, the restaurant owner, had successfully navigated a tax audit with confidence because he understood his obligations. Dozens of others who'd transformed their relationship with money from fear to competence. 3 years ago, Grant began, I believed that success meant accumulating wealth and status. I thought that winning was the only thing that mattered, and I built a career on that belief. I was very successful by those metrics. I was also miserable, though I didn't realize it at the time. He paused, gathering his thoughts. What I've learned through this work is that success isn't about accumulation. It's about contribution. It's not about how much you can take, but about what you can give. And the most profound satisfaction doesn't come from being impressive, but from being useful. Claire was standing in the back of the room, and their eyes met across the distance. She didn't smile, but Grant saw acknowledgement in her expression. Recognition that he'd actually changed, that the transformation was real and lasting. After his speech, Grant spent an hour talking with program graduates, celebrating their achievements, offering encouragement for their next challenges. It was the kind of unglamorous, unrecognized work that his old self would have considered beneath him. His new self understood it was exactly where he needed to be. As the event was winding down, Claire approached him. That was a good speech, honest without being self-indulgent. I've had practice learning the difference. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the remaining attendees chat and network. After a moment, Claire spoke quietly. I've been thinking about something, about how our story ends. Grant felt his chest tighten. How do you mean? For a long time, I thought it ended at the gala. With your career destroyed and me triumphant, the ultimate revenge story. She turned to face him. But that's not where it ended. It ended here, with both of us doing work that actually matters, with you becoming someone I can respect again, and me learning to let go of anger I thought I'd carry forever. Is that closure? Grant asked softly. I think it's better than closure. It's transformation. We both became different people, better people, I hope, because of what happened between us. The betrayal, the divorce, the takedown. All of it was terrible, but it forced us to confront who we actually were and decide if that was who we wanted to stay. Grant nodded slowly. I wouldn't have chosen this path. If you'd asked me 3 years ago whether I'd trade my career and reputation for the chance to teach financial literacy to small business owners, I would have laughed at you. And now? Now I understand that I needed to lose everything I thought I wanted so I could find the things that actually matter. Claire studied his face for a long moment, then did something that surprised them both. She extended her hand, not for a handshake but palm up, an offering. Grant looked at her hand, understanding the symbolism. This was Claire offering partnership again, not romantic or marital, but the kind of professional collaboration they'd once had before he'd destroyed it. A chance to build something together without the weight of their shared history crushing it. He took her hand, and they stood there for a moment. Two people who'd wounded each other deeply and somehow found their way to something like peace. Thank you, Grant said quietly, for giving me this chance, for seeing potential in me that I couldn't see in myself, for being patient enough to let me become someone worth your respect. Thank you for doing the work to actually change instead of just performing change, Claire replied. It would have been easier to take your skills somewhere else and rebuild your old career. Choosing to stay here to do work that doesn't feed your ego, that took real courage. They released hands, and the moment passed, but something had shifted between them. Not forgiveness exactly, because Claire had already given him that. Not reconciliation, because what they'd had before was gone and couldn't be recovered. But something new, a foundation for moving forward without the weight of past betrayals defining their future. The years that followed were marked by steady, unglamorous progress. Grant built the Community Impact Division into one of EquerVenture's flagship initiatives, recognized nationally for its innovative approach to financial education and economic development. He trained hundreds of instructors, developed partnerships with dozens of community organizations, and helped thousands of people transform their relationship with money. He never remarried, never tried to rebuild the social connections that had defined his first career. His father visited occasionally from Arizona, always pleased to see Grant doing work that actually helped people. David Chen reached out every few months, sending small consulting projects that Grant completed competently, but without the driving ambition that had once characterized his work. Claire built EquerVentures into a model of ethical capital management, proving that firms could be both profitable and principled. She was profiled in business journals, invited to speak at conferences, recognized as one of the most influential executives in the financial sector. But she maintained her focus on the work itself rather than the recognition, staying true to the values that had driven her transformation. They remained colleagues, occasionally becoming something like friends during long strategy sessions or community events. But they both understood that certain doors, once closed, couldn't be reopened. Their romantic partnership was finished, destroyed by Grant's betrayal and the years of anger that had followed. What they had now was better suited to who they'd become, a professional relationship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to meaningful work. 5 years after the gala, Grant was invited to speak at his business school's annual conference. The topic was ethical leadership, and Grant had initially declined, uncomfortable with the idea of lecturing others when his own ethics had been so questionable for so long. But the dean had been persistent, arguing that Grant's story of transformation was precisely what current students needed to hear. So Grant accepted and found himself standing before an auditorium full of ambitious MBA candidates who reminded him painfully of his younger self. I'm going to tell you something that goes against everything you're learning in your strategy classes, Grant began. Winning isn't actually the goal. Contribution is the goal. Impact is the goal. Becoming someone who uses their abilities to solve problems rather than exploit people, that's the goal. He told them about his rise and fall, about the career he'd built on conflicts of interest and strategic ruthlessness, about the woman he'd betrayed and the spectacular way she'd destroyed him for it. He didn't minimize his culpability or perform contrition he didn't feel. He just told the truth about who he'd been and who he'd become. The question isn't whether you'll be successful, Grant said. Most of you will achieve conventional success. The money, the titles, the recognition. The question is whether you'll build that success on foundations that can withstand scrutiny. Whether you'll treat people as ends in themselves or as means to your advancement. Whether you'll have the courage to be useful instead of just impressive. After the speech, dozens of students approached with questions. Some were skeptical, suggesting that Grant's transformation was just another strategic move. Others were genuinely curious about how to balance ambition with ethics. Grant answered them all honestly, acknowledging when he didn't have good answers, refusing to pretend that he'd figured everything out. As the crowd thinned, Grant noticed a woman standing off to the side, waiting patiently. He recognized her after a moment, one of the junior analysts from his old firm who'd watched him leave with his box of office belongings 5 years ago. "Mr. Harlow, I don't know if you remember me. I'm Sophie Chen. I worked at Harlow and Associates until it was restructured after you left. I remember. You were one of David's analysts. I wanted to tell you something." Sophie glanced around, then lowered her voice. "What you did, the way you left, the testimony, all of it, it changed how we thought about the work. David implemented new ethics protocols, created whistleblower protections, started actually caring about whether our deals were legitimate and not just profitable. The firm is smaller now, but it's better, more honest." Grant felt something catch in his throat. "I'm glad to hear that. I just thought you should know that your transformation didn't just affect you. It rippled out, changed things for a lot of us who were watching." Sophie smiled. "I left the firm last year to do nonprofit consulting. I make about half what I used to, but I actually believe in the work I'm doing, so thank you for showing us that it's possible to choose a different path." After Sophie left, Grant stood in the empty auditorium, thinking about ripple effects and unintended consequences. He'd destroyed his career through arrogance and ethical compromise, but in doing so, he'd accidentally created an example that had helped others make better choices. His failures had become teaching moments for people he'd never met. It wasn't redemption, exactly, but it was something like purpose. Grant's phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Saw your speech was today. Hope it went well. We're still on for the board meeting tomorrow?" He typed back. "It went better than expected. See you at 9. Her response was just a thumbs up emoji, but Grant smiled anyway. This was what their relationship had become: professional courtesy, occasional warmth, the comfortable communication of people who'd been through hell together and come out changed on the other side. He would never stop regretting the betrayal that had destroyed their marriage. Would never stop wishing he'd been wise enough to value Claire when they'd been partners, instead of learning her worth only after he'd lost her. But he'd also learned to live with that regret without letting it define him, to acknowledge his failures while still moving forward. As Grant left the business school and headed back to his modest apartment in Riverside, he thought about the various versions of himself that had existed over the years. The ambitious entrepreneur who'd married Claire for practical reasons and eventually convinced himself it was love. The ruthless dealmaker who'd discarded her when she no longer fit his image of success. The disgraced executive forced to confront what he'd become. The teacher learning to be useful instead of impressive. The director building programs that actually helped people. All of them were real. All of them were him. But the person he was becoming, someone who valued contribution over accumulation, service over status, authentic impact over performed success, that person was someone he could finally respect. Someone who used his considerable abilities to solve problems rather than exploit them. Someone who'd learned painfully and completely that winning at any cost was the surest path to losing everything that mattered. Years later, when people asked Grant about his relationship with Claire Hanley, he would tell them the truth. "She destroyed me," he'd say, "completely, methodically, using every lesson I'd ever taught her about leverage and strategy. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because I needed to be destroyed so I could be rebuilt as someone worth being." And if they asked whether he'd ever forgiven her for the takedown, Grant would smile and shake his head. "There's nothing to forgive. She gave me exactly what I deserved, the consequences of my choices. What she gave me after that, the chance to rebuild on better foundations, that was grace I'll never be able to repay." Claire would have scoffed at the dramatics if she'd heard him say it. She'd built Equor Ventures into something remarkable, not as an act of grace, but as a business decision. She'd hired Grant not to save him, but because his skills matched what she needed. But sometimes, late at night when she was reviewing quarterly reports and seeing the impact data from the Community Impact Division, Claire would allow herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Not because she'd destroyed Grant's career, that victory had lost its sweetness years ago, but because she'd helped him become someone who used his brilliance for something other than self-advancement. They'd both become better people through the destruction of their marriage and the painful reconstruction that followed. They'd both learned that success wasn't about crushing your enemies or achieving status, but about building something meaningful and helping others do the same. It wasn't the ending either of them would have chosen if they'd been writing the story from the beginning. But it was an honest ending, earned through failure and transformation and the hard work of becoming people who could look at themselves without shame. And sometimes that was enough.